It's 1775, and the colonists of North America have been thrust into war. From Lexington to Yorktown, brother will fight brother as the once loyal 13 colonies fight for the mother country or for liberty and a new era. This is the story of the American Revolution. Join us as we explore the key battles, the strategies, and the politics that will one day lead to the birth of a nation. Since the outbreak of war in 1775, the northern colonies had become the epicenter of the fighting. The North had long been a hotbed of revolution, with cities like Boston being long-standing centers of resistance against British rule. In an attempt to destroy the revolution where it was best supported, the British focused much of their efforts in New England. But by 1778, the two sides are at a stalemate, and the British are looking for a way to turn the tide. The southern colonies are very different from their northern neighbours. Their economies revolve predominantly around agriculture, with a plantation system cultivating cash crops like tobacco and rice, requiring vast tracts of land and a large labour force to work the fields. The population of the colonies is spread relatively evenly, with the total black and white population at over 2.1 million by the 1770s. But almost 90% of slaves reside in the South, making up close to half its population. Slavery is critical to the southern economies, with the profitability of plantations dependent on the practice. To maintain the delicate stability of the system and guard against the threat of slave revolts, many southern leaders, both Patriot and Loyalist, are cautious to fully mobilize for war. But fighting has persisted nonetheless. In Virginia, the royal governor, Lord Dunmore, planned to resist at the outbreak of war. His proclamation in 1775 dramatically raises the stakes in the colony. He offers freedom to slaves who leave their masters and join the British Army, proclaims martial law, and brands anyone who does not take up arms for the king a traitor. Dunmore's proclamation leaves little room for compromise and strongly contradicts what Virginians consider to be their most basic rights. Lord Dunmore raises Loyalist militias and a regiment of former slaves, but his proclamation had, by and large, infuriated Virginians, and in late 1775, the British forces are routed at the Battle of Great Bridge and swiftly expelled from the colony. In the Carolinas, without the presence of British regular forces, both sides race to raise local militias. Patriots dominate the towns and Loyalists the backcountry. In February 76, the two forces finally meet, and the fate of the colony is decided by a Highland charge of sword-wielding Scottish settlers against dug-in Patriot forces. The Loyalists are decimated in the battle by accurate musket fire, and the defeat leads to the capture of close to 1,000 Loyalists and the mass arrest of their leadership. The British face similar setbacks in Georgia, where the royal governor, James Wright, is forced to flee in March 1776. The only place where the British are able to hold on is Florida, where a number of continental expeditions sent to capture St. Augustine are repelled. The town quickly overflows with Loyalist refugees fleeing the Carolinas and Georgia, who avidly burn effigies of revolutionary leaders like Sam Adams and John Hancock in the city centre. But for the rest of the South, for the first 3 years of the war, the British would leave the colonies almost entirely uncontested and in the hands of Patriot forces. Despite many Loyalists feeling betrayed by the lack of action, support for the king remains in the South, particularly in rural communities. And General Clinton now plans to use this support as he moves to break the deadlock in the war. When war broke out at Lexington in 1775, many American colonists faced a stark choice. This was not simply a war against the British, but a civil war between Americans. And before independence could be achieved, those loyal to the crown would also have to be defeated. The resulting war would divide families, shatter communities, and create deep ideological rifts that would reshape the future of a nation and the world. Civil wars, by their nature, are often more brutal than wars between nations. Cycles of revenge and retaliation escalate and fuel the violence, and the American Revolution would be no different, with some of the bloodiest battles of the war being fought between American-only units. Across the 13 colonies, individuals had to consider their core beliefs. By choosing a side, are you defending your country or taking up arms against it? Loyalism cut across social, racial, and ideological lines in the 13 colonies. Some felt a strong allegiance to king and country, while others were more pragmatic and considered their own self-interest and self-preservation in a tumultuous war. But few had a blind allegiance to Britain. Most loyalists still cherished their rights and yearned for the political representation afforded to them as Englishmen. Loyalists often shared the very same grievances as their Patriot countrymen against Parliament in London. But when war finally came, they ultimately chose a different side. Historians estimate that between 1 in 5 and 1 in 3 colonists remained loyal, and during the war, up to 50,000 Americans fought in loyalist militias, provincial regiments, or directly in the British Army. A further 20,000 slaves fought for the British, including slaves owned by Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, along with well over 10,000 Indians. But why did they fight, and what happened to them after the war? From the outset of the conflict, British military planners understood that the small and globally stretched British Army would need large-scale loyalist support to defeat the rebellion. Efforts to recruit loyalists partly relied on appeals to emotion, love for your country, nostalgia for British roots, and the stability of the current government and rule of law. But material self-interest also played its part. Offers of financial bounties for joining were common, and more importantly, generous land grants were offered to new recruits. Many that signed up were landless labourers, sons of farmers, or recent immigrants, and the offer of land in the 13 colonies, once the war was won, became an enticing offer. There were also significant risks. To raise funds and weaken loyalist support, Patriot forces and revolutionary governments engaged in widespread confiscation of loyalist property. The British Army also had a poor reputation for capturing territory, raising loyalist forces, and then quickly abandoning the area, leaving entire families to face retribution from Patriots. As the war progressed, many tens of thousands of men, women, and children on both sides moved to get behind friendly lines to escape persecution. For the Loyalists, hubs primarily revolved around New York in the north and St. Augustine in the south. For the 20,000 runaway slaves who joined the Loyalist cause, or the 5,000 that joined the Patriots, the risks were far more stark. Leaving a plantation was extremely dangerous, and little quarter could be expected if captured after a battle. For those brave enough to leave their masters, the choice of who to join was simple: which side offered the most promising route to freedom. The majority of loyalists who signed up to fight were organised into provincial regiments. These units were often trained and equipped similarly to the British Army and included formations like the Loyal American Rangers, the Royal Regiment of New York, and the King's American Dragoons. They participated in major campaigns alongside British forces and often acted as light infantry, combating Patriot irregular forces and their guerrilla tactics. For men captured on both sides, it was common to switch allegiances, sometimes more than once, rather than face an internment camp, prison ship, or worse. And after a battle, it was not uncommon for entire local militias to switch sides, as happened in New York after the British arrival. After the war ended, 100,000 Americans would leave the new country, representing close to 5% of the pre-war population. These Americans travelled far and wide and received financial compensation, land, and supplies in an empire-wide program for refugees. A small number moved to Britain, but most left for new beginnings in other colonies like Nova Scotia and the Caribbean. Some loyalists found themselves in the employment of the East India Company as new colonists in Australia, or for some black loyalists, settlers of a new African colony of former slaves in Freetown, Sierra Leone. These men and women brought American ways of thinking that spread with them across the empire. That often included a strong sense of their rights, a disdain for imperial authority, and demands for political representation. The war had been damaging for the British, and it marked the start of a transition from a commercial Atlantic empire to a new beginning in Asia. That recovery was in large part supported by American loyalists who advocated expansion and helped rebuild the empire in a new image, with liberal ideas that stood as a strong alternative to the new Republican movements growing in France and across the Americas. In the end, the fate of many of the loyalists mirrored that of the empire itself. After the misery of civil war, global success and international preeminence lay on the horizon. In late 1778, General Clinton is considering his options for the war, following the inconclusive battles of Monmouth and Rhode Island in the previous months. He has some 29,000 men in New York and is under increasing pressure from his political masters in London to open a new front in the south. It is widely believed that loyalists are quietly waiting for an opportunity to rise up against the rebels in the southern states, and the arrival of British troops would quickly collapse continental control. By November 78, Clinton is ready to send a force of 3,000 men south. 1 British, 2 Hessian, and 4 Loyalist regiments are dispatched with the mission of capturing Savannah and returning Georgia to British rule. Further north lay the true prize, capturing the city of Charlestown in the more populous South Carolina. The British force is led by the capable Scotsman, Lieutenant Colonel Campbell, and they arrive near the mouth of the Savannah River on the 23rd of December. They are opposed by 850 Continental regulars and militia who attempt to hold the British back outside of the city. During the engagement, the British flank the Continental force, causing a rout. In the aftermath, Savannah is quickly captured, and in the following days, the countryside falls to British forces. Local loyalists quickly begin a revenge campaign, burning Patriot farms and plantations. By mid-January, several thousand British reinforcements arrive from Florida under the command of the Anglo-Swiss general Augustin Prevost, who assumes command of British forces in the south. Campbell is soon sent north and captures Augusta in late January, the seat of the Patriot government in Georgia. With the rapid British advances, loyalists begin turning out in large numbers, and over 1,000 men are enrolled in Augusta alone. For the British command, the southern strategy appears to be working, with more and more militias forming to join their campaign. In South Carolina, a wealthy landowner, Lieutenant Colonel John Boyd, has been raising a loyalist militia of some 800 men to march to Augusta and join the British. But the Continentals have not been passive since the disaster at Savannah. The Continental Army commander in the South, Major General Benjamin Lincoln, has been raising forces of his own. One such Patriot militia, under the command of another South Carolinian landowner, Colonel Andrew Pickens, has been carefully tracking Boyd and his men as they move south into Georgia. On the morning of the 14th of February, the Loyalist camp is quiet. Now in friendlier territory, the horses are loose grazing, and few pickets have been posted. The British flag is raised for the first time since entering Georgia, and drums beat. But at 10 a.m, the situation is about to rapidly change. Colonel Pickens has some 400 Patriot militiamen and advances from the high ground towards the camp. Although they are outnumbered almost 2 to 1, the Patriots have the element of surprise on their side. As they approach, musket fire is exchanged with Loyalist sentries, which alerts the rest of the camp to the danger. Boyd quickly assembles 100 picked men and scrambles to a makeshift defensive line against a fence to meet their oncoming countrymen. The militias exchange fire in the centre, with both sides holding their own in the struggle. In the smoke and chaos, neither side gives way until the Loyalist leader Boyd is hit and falls mortally wounded to the ground. Panic soon spreads, and the Loyalists retreat back to their main defensive line, abandoning their horses and baggage in the process. Pickens has sent part of his force through swamps to flank either side of the camp, but the Loyalists had crossed the river, and despite the shock of battle and losing their commander, they were now reforming on a hill. Without wasting time, Pickens' men begin charging across the river, while under fire, to attack the hill from 3 sides. The fighting continues for almost an hour, but assaulted from multiple directions, the Loyalists eventually break and disperse into the surrounding countryside. As the firing dies down, Pickens finds Boyd dying on the field. The two had known each other before the war in South Carolina, and Pickens quickly calls for medical treatment. The two men talk about the battle like old friends, and Boyd gives Pickens a letter for his wife, which he would deliver following Boyd's death only hours later. The battle had been costly for the Loyalists, who suffered 70 dead and another 75 captured. Although 270 of them would eventually join up with the British, hundreds more would go home and to the mercy of Patriot authorities. More importantly, the battle severely dampens Loyalist recruitment efforts across the South, highlighting again the inability of the British to protect locally raised troops. In Augusta, Campbell has been hearing reports of approaching Continental forces. On the 14th of February, he abandons the town and begins to retreat south. But the British keep an eye on the Continentals and strike out at the Battle of Briar Creek on March 3rd, almost smashing the entire Continental force. The battle causes a large number of Patriot militiamen to go home in turn, but despite the victory, Augusta and much of the backcountry fall back into Continental hands. By June, General Lincoln has regrouped his forces and now has some 2,000 men ready to march from Charlestown, but to recapture Savannah, he would need naval assistance. Fortunately for Lincoln, French Admiral Astan is on hand with a large fleet and 4,000 troops. The French admiral had spent the first half of the year attacking and capturing British possessions in the Caribbean, but he was now back to assist the Continentals in the south. By September, the Allies are ready, and both Lincoln and Astan move against Savannah. The city, consisting of some 450 houses, sits on hills above the river. The British, using slave labour, have built extensive defensive works outside of the city and have almost 5,000 men defending it. They have also scuttled ships to limit French naval access as much as possible. In early October, the bombardment of the city begins. Although a majority of Savannah's buildings are damaged, the British defences remain intact. When the British failed to surrender, Astan, who was eager to end the siege quickly due to disease spreading on his ships, next plans an assault. On the evening of October 8th, Astan and Lincoln issue orders for the Allied attack. They plan for a feint on the left, while French and American columns strike against British redoubts on the right. Redoubts that are thought to be poorly defended before clearing the then breached defensive works to the river. But the British have been informed of the Allied plan. A sergeant major in the Continental Army deserts to the British after receiving Lincoln's orders and tells General Prevost of the Franco-American attack. Later that morning at 4 a.m, the Allied assault begins. A dense morning fog covers the battlefield, limiting communication and confusing the advancing Allies. The feint on the left does its job and holds down British troops, while the French in the centre attack Loyalists from North Carolina but struggle to make progress. On the right and the main attack, French columns in their white uniforms are slowed down by swamps, and their formations begin to lose cohesion. The main target for the Allies is a major British redoubt on the right, now garrisoned by Scotsmen and Loyalist militias. In bloody trench-to-trench fighting, some French units make good progress as the assaults intensify. But casualties are starting to mount, with dozens of Frenchmen being cut down by grape shot and accurate American rifle fire. To the left of the French, the first Continental wave against the main British redoubt makes equally good progress, and their flag is hoisted on the exterior slopes. But in dogged fighting, the British are still able to hang on, eventually driving the assault back. A second Continental wave moves forward, but following orders from the French, they move too far left and find themselves stuck on swampy ground and under torrential cannon fire. As the fighting rages across the fortifications, Count Pulaski, in charge of the Continental Cavalry, takes 200 of his horsemen forward. The cavalry begin to charge at full speed and attempt to bypass the British defences and storm deep into the city. But despite the cavalry's bravery, enfilade fire from British positions starts to devastate their ranks. Count Pulaski is hit by grape shot fire and falls mortally wounded. His men soon abandon the attack and carry their dying commander back to friendly lines. With this final failure, Astan, wounded twice himself in the arm and leg, calls off the assault. The battle has been costly and a disaster for the Franco-American cause. Almost 900 men are lost, with hundreds of bodies piled up across Savannah's defensive works. The next day, despite pleas from Lincoln to continue the siege, Astan has had enough and decides to withdraw to his ships and then the safety of the Caribbean. After the battle, a stalemate in Georgia resumes. The Continentals retreat north to Augusta and Charlestown, while the British begin a program of re-establishing civil administration. James Wright returns as the royal governor, along with new judges, magistrates, and pro-British civil leaders. Far further north, Washington has been pursuing a Fabian strategy against British General Clinton's main army and refusing to give battle. Instead, both sides have been conducting guerrilla warfare and raids, the British against coastal towns and the Continentals against Britain's Indian allies. By the end of 1779, Clinton, frustrated by a lack of progress and inspired by the victory at Savannah, now decides to shift the focus of his operations to the south. In late December, Clinton and his second-in-command, Cornwallis, leave New York with 8,500 men. For control of the southern colonies, the great prize remains in Charlestown in South Carolina. The city is the largest in the south, with a major port and easy access to the surrounding colonies. For Clinton in early 1780, desperate to retake the initiative in the war, the city is now his target. By mid-February, the British stand 30 miles south of Charlestown and begin their advance on the city. Continental General Lincoln remains in command, and he has been building defences in the city and the surrounding forts. But his force is too poorly trained and equipped to attempt to proactively attack the British on their approach, like Washington had done in Philadelphia 3 years earlier. Although some urge him to abandon the city while he still can, Lincoln is also under considerable political pressure to hold and prevent the British gaining a critical base in the south. Charlestown is situated on a peninsula, making it appearingly naturally defendable. But to a foe with a large navy, Charlestown is also vulnerable, with those same natural defences working against it. Lincoln expects the main attack to come from land and has slaves build lines of trenches and redoubts across the neck. While the Continentals continue to prepare for a siege, the British slowly tighten the noose around the city. Throughout the siege, South Carolinian Loyalist dragoons, under the command of the infamous Savannah Charleston, will defeat a number of Patriot forces lingering outside the city with ruthless efficiency. The Royal Navy, although receiving damage from cannon fire at Fort Moultrie, enters the inner harbour on the 8th of April. At the same time, British siege works are also completed and the cannonade starts against the city and its defences. Firebombs and red-hot shots are purposefully used by the British, quickly causing fires to spread. An informal fire brigade is organised in the city, while citizens seek protection in their cellars. British siege works creep closer and closer, and by the 19th of April, they are only 250 yards away from the main defensive line. Lincoln attempts limited sorties to attack British positions, but these are poorly coordinated and easily repulsed. As days pass, the situation becomes more and more dire for the defenders. Lincoln, under pressure from civil leaders and his Council of War, soon begins to consider his options. But evacuation is now impossible due to a lack of boats and the presence of British shore batteries and the Royal Navy. There is also no sign of a relief force coming, leaving him in an increasingly difficult position. Despite a good start, all was not well in the British camp. General Cornwallis, frustrated that he himself is not in overall command, has been increasingly hostile to Clinton and now refuses to cooperate altogether. Cornwallis and Clinton have very different strategies for the war, Clinton favouring a more defensive approach to hold key cities and territory, while Cornwallis favours offensive operations to subdue the countryside. Much to Clinton's anger, he eventually gives in to Cornwallis's requests for a separate, independent command. To tighten the screws further, Cornwallis moves to take surrounding fortifications in late April. On the main line of contact, the British taunt the garrison by firing shots of rice and sugar over the defences. With the army's rations already having to be cut, morale begins to plummet. The final fort outside of the city is captured in early May, all while Charlestown is pounded by British batteries. Many in General Lincoln's Council of War had been urging him to surrender the city, and on May 10th, a petition is sent to Lincoln from both the militia and citizens of Charlestown asking him to capitulate. With supplies running low and no prospect of reinforcements or escape, the next day a white flag is hoisted on the outer works. After just 6 weeks of resistance, the siege of Charlestown is over. The battle has been a staggering defeat for the Patriot cause, with 5,500 men captured. Worse still, despite Lincoln attempting to negotiate for better terms, the British demand only total surrender. Traditionally, a defeated army is granted the honours of war, allowing them to surrender with flags flying, drums beating, and their weapons in hand. Clinton was in no mood to grant these terms, however, and the Continentals are forced to lay down their arms and surrender unconditionally, an act widely seen as a mark of disgrace for an army. Although militiamen and officers are for the most part paroled, for many Continental troops, the notoriously harsh conditions of prison ships now awaited them. Clinton had finally achieved the decisive victory he had sought in New York, but his success was also down to Continental failings. Lincoln had been unwilling to abandon a position of serious disadvantage, and worse still, he had conducted a lackluster defense of it. He had harbored unrealistic expectations of relief and ultimately allowed pressure from civilians to guide his decision-making. After the battle, there are almost no substantial Continental forces left in the South, and the British begin consolidating their grip on Georgia while rapidly expanding their control in South Carolina. Patriot support is now at its lowest in the southern colonies, and the British appear poised for sweeping gains. The gamble south, so far, seemed to be working for General Clinton, but both partisan and Continental forces are massing around him, and they have no intention of letting the recent defeats go unanswered. Following the major British victories at Charlestown and Savannah, by the spring of 1780, the Continental Army has been almost entirely defeated in the south. While Congress reels from the defeat and prepares a response, the only thing now standing between Britain and the complete recapture of the southern colonies is localized resistance and hastily organized militias. What will follow is an unconventional and brutal war of ambushes, skirmishes and raids, where ingenuity and perseverance become crucial to victory. By May 1780, British influence is rapidly spreading in the south. Hundreds of local representatives, including former Patriot governors, assembly presidents, and prominent citizens, congratulate General Clinton on his recent successes and offer their support. The British strategy appears to be working, matching military supremacy with the enticing offer of a new imperial relationship that grants most of the colonial demands from the start of the war, including self-governance within the empire. The British also attempt reconciliation by paroling prisoners and offering pardons to active rebels. The conditions are generally lenient and require men not to rejoin the fight against the British. There is growing apathy for the war in the South, and with rumors circulating that Congress is ready to cede the Carolinas and Georgia to Britain in exchange for peace, many now become disillusioned and accept the offer to go home. Meanwhile, General Clinton has received intelligence that the French may strike against New York, and in June he prepares to sail north. But Clinton is taking the majority of British regulars, cavalry, and heavy equipment with him. General Cornwallis is to be left in charge with 3,000 regulars and 3,000 American provincials and militiamen. With such a small force, Cornwallis has a daunting task ahead of him. His instructions are to pacify South Carolina and Georgia before driving into North Carolina and eventually Virginia. Clinton and Cornwallis are still deeply divided, marked by frequent miscommunication and strategic disagreements. This is epitomized before Clinton's departure, when he issues a new proclamation without consulting Cornwallis or other senior officers. All Americans that have recently been released on parole are now required to take fresh oaths of allegiance and to actively support the British, which in practice likely means joining a loyalist militia. Those who refuse are to be once again treated as rebels and face arrest or worse. Cornwallis and other British commanders are left baffled and furious once they hear about Clinton's decision. Cornwallis believes that the war can be won by relying on the growing neutrality of Americans and by not forcing them to pick a side. But Clinton's new proclamation effectively requires Americans who would have previously honoured their paroles and sat out the war to now join the British cause. This was something many Americans would bitterly resist and would now thrust many of them back into active opposition. What's left of the Continental Army in the South has been retreating following the defeat at Charlestown. By the end of May, they abandon Camden, and Colonel Buford leads some 400 men towards North Carolina to regroup with other forces. But Cornwallis is well informed by locals of the Continental movements, and Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton and his loyalist dragoons of the British Legion have been sent in pursuit. 15 miles outside of Camden, the British finally catch up to Buford in the Waxhaw region. Tarleton is outnumbered more than 2-1 with just 150 horsemen. But after covering over 100 miles in just 2.5 days, the Loyalists are determined to meet the retreating Continentals. Events of the battle are long disputed, but by 3 p.m. on the 29th of May, the Loyalist vanguard reaches the Continental rear, and Buford forms up his men for battle. Tarleton's force is split into 3 divisions, and with the sound of cavalry bugles, they advance forward. Momentum builds, and at 300 yards from the Continental line, the charge begins. The Dragoons start at a canter and progress to a full gallop 150 yards from the Continental lines. The cavalry can cover the entire distance in under 45 seconds, giving the Continentals enough time for just one effective shot. Buford waits until the last moment until he orders to fire, and with the volley, Tarleton's horse is shot from under him along with a number of his men. But it is not enough to stop the Loyalist charge, who now, believing their commander killed, press home the attack. With the terrifying speed of the cavalry assault, it is likely that Buford now attempts to surrender by sending out a white flag. But in the chaos of battle, and with Tarleton trapped under his horse, the white flag is either not seen or purposefully ignored. In either case, the Continental lines soon break, and for 15 minutes, the Dragoons hack a bloody path through their countrymen. By the time Tarleton has found a fresh mount and regained control of his men, 250 Continentals lay dead or badly wounded. Another 50 would soon be captured and then paroled after the battle. The victory appearingly further secures British control in South Carolina, removing one of the last major Continental forces in the area. But news of the battle is spreading, and reports and rumours tell of a bloody slaughter where the British gave no quarter to surrendering troops. Word of a massacre sends shockwaves through the South, and combined with Clinton's recent proclamation, almost overnight, volunteer militias start to silently mobilise across the backcountry. As spring turns to summer in 1780, Cornwallis begins re-establishing British administration in the South. He believes the key to this is control of the countryside, but to pacify the territory, he desperately needs more men. A Scottish officer, Major Patrick Ferguson, is appointed to recruit and lead new Loyalist militias. 8 fresh battalions are quickly raised, and the skirmishing with Patriot forces begins in earnest. In Lincoln County, North Carolina, despite being ordered not to muster until the arrival of British troops, in June 1,300 Loyalists, confident the war is turning in their favour, gather to march south. But much like at Kettle Creek a year earlier, they are smashed in a surprise attack at the Battle of Ramsar's Mill by a much smaller Patriot force, quickly evaporating support for the Crown in the area. This action is repeated again and again through the summer of 1780, where the Patriots, often outnumbered, destroy a number of Loyalist militias in a brutal civil conflict between neighbours and friends. Although many of the battles will go unrecorded, across the region, Loyalist camps are assaulted, patrols and dispatch riders are ambushed, and supply trains are seized. The Patriot forces are often uncoordinated and lack the professionalism of an army, but this is also what makes them effective. Francis Marion, who would become known as the Swamp Fox, epitomizes this spirit. Marion's force is one of many small bands of men using their knowledge of the swamps and backcountry to strike swiftly before disappearing into the wilderness, frustrating larger and better equipped Loyalist forces. The Patriots target British supply lines and outposts, while the Loyalists, organised by Ferguson, attempt to fight conventional battles and conduct punitive raids against Patriot communities. But the increasing number of Patriot victories is creating a groundswell of local support in many areas, providing critical intelligence, supplies, and safe havens for the partisans. Cornwallis and the British command move from optimism in June to despair by August. Although Cornwallis maintains uneasy control over much of the territory, his logistics are seriously hampered, while both the credibility of British authority and local support for the Crown slowly deteriorates. Cornwallis writes to Clinton that there is now an absolute state of rebellion in the South. Like his predecessors had found in the North, Cornwallis is fast learning that capturing key urban centres is one thing, but controlling the vast, hostile countryside is quite another. By early August, after a grueling summer, the British finally receive intelligence that a continental army is moving south. The news is welcomed by Cornwallis. The war is, at long last, returning to the type of conventional fighting he is all too well accustomed to. Following the defeat at Charlestown in March, Congress had appointed General Horatio Gates as the new commander in the South. After the stunning victory at Saratoga in 77, which Gates received the credit for, he was an obvious choice for Congress, although not the preference of Washington, who had recommended Nathanael Greene for the role. Gates, a former British Army officer, is an ambitious and confident general. He arrives to take command in late July, dubbing his men the Grand Army of the Southern Department. But Gates has a disorganized and poorly supplied force, largely composed of militia and a corps of 1,400 Delaware and Maryland hardened veterans. Gates is informed that the British are scattered and tied down across the South, and that Cornwallis has not yet moved from Charlestown. His senior officers advise patience to build up their forces, supplies, and an intelligence network in the region. But Gates sees an opportunity. Although a risk, a swift victory against a vulnerable British garrison at Camden could build morale in his army and perhaps even persuade the British to fully withdraw to Charlestown. After just 2 days in command, Gates decides to roll the dice, and he orders his men on the road to Camden. Not wanting to waste time, he advances on the most direct route south through barren swamps and mostly loyalist areas. This means he is unable to rendezvous with other nearby friendly formations, while desertions and sickness take their toll. But it does allow for a relatively swift advance, and the Continentals arrive close to Camden by mid-August. Gates has calculated that his army is 7,000 strong, and he plans to surround and destroy the small British garrison in a surprise assault. He orders a final night march to Camden on the 15th, but his senior officers remain deeply skeptical, prompting a count of the troops. The tally reveals only 3,000 to 4,000 men are fit for duty, but when this is reported to Gates, he remains confident and the advance continues. As the army marches towards Camden, at 2 a.m, fighting is unexpectedly heard at the front of the column. An unknown cavalry force has ridden directly into the Continental vanguard, and a confused melee ensues. Prisoners are captured and immediately brought to Gates. The unknown cavalry force turns out to be none other than Tarleton's British Legion, and Gates quickly learns, to his horror, that he faces Cornwallis on the march with 2,000 troops. 1 week earlier, Cornwallis had been informed by spies that the Continentals were advancing to Camden, and he quickly moved to reinforce it from Charlestown. Cornwallis is also rolling the dice. His intelligence suggests the Continentals number 6,000 men, and if his army is defeated, Camden would soon fall, along with the 800 sick and wounded he has resting in the town. Such a defeat would almost certainly lead to a full British withdrawal back to Charlestown, undoing the past year's progress and the entire Southern strategy. By a complete coincidence, both armies had started night marches on the same road, and both were now locked in for a decisive battle the next day. As dawn breaks on a hot and humid August morning, both armies are deployed on the field with 300 yards between them. Both Gates and Cornwallis have arrayed their forces following British military doctrine of the day, their stronger regulars on the right flank and their weaker militias on the left. As cannons open fire, the opening moves begin on the Patriot left. Both sides observe the other maneuvering on the flank, and in an attempt to take advantage, mutually order advances. the Virginian militia, some 800 strong and 2 to 3 ranks deep, advance in loose lines, with officers shouting encouragement to their men. British commanders often seek to close the distance quickly to allow for shock bayonet charges, and at Camden, it was no different. The regulars are shoulder to shoulder and using a well-drilled advance and fire tactic, firing a volley, stepping forward while reloading, and then shouting huzzah before firing once more. The lead musket balls are an ounce in weight and deliver horrific damage, the impact often knocking men to the ground. To the untrained militia, the sight of the advancing British line and their 18-inch bayonets is terrifying. The Virginians reply with 1 or 2 frantic volleys, but as the prospect of a charge looms closer, one man drops his musket and runs. Panic has now gripped the Virginians, and soon a second, a third, and then a dozen more start running from the front. Fear can be infectious during a battle, and almost instantaneously, the entirety of the Virginian militia, officers and men alike, turn and flee for their lives. To make matters worse, the sight of the retreating Virginians is causing a ripple effect. The panic has become a contagion, and the 2,000-strong North Carolinian militia, who have yet to fully engage the British, now join in the rout, running headfirst into the Continental reserves. Gates, upon seeing his left disintegrate, now believes the battle is lost, and he flees at full gallop and without stopping to give further orders to the town of Charlotte, 65 miles north. But the battle is not over. The disciplined Continentals on the right are still in the fight and appear completely unfazed by the retreating militia. The veterans are opposed by loyalist North Carolinian and Irish militias, along with provincial regiments. The 2nd Maryland Brigade and Delaware regiments throw back several charges, before themselves counterattacking and taking a number of prisoners in the process. For at least half an hour, Cornwallis is barely able to keep his own left flank from collapsing, and he personally rides up and down the line, shouting encouragement while under fire to steady his men. The British regulars on the right have resisted the temptation to chase the fleeing militias and are now reformed and wheeling around to attack the Continental flank. The 1st Maryland Brigade in reserve has moved forward to cover the left as best they can, but they are heavily outnumbered, and despite their bravery, they are being forced to give ground. A grizzled veteran commander, Major General DeKalb, is in charge of the Continental right. His horse has been shot from under him, but with his sword in hand, he's able to lead a number of counterattacks to hold back the encircling British, personally cutting down a number of enemy soldiers in the process. The fighting continues for an hour in a brutal slugging match, with smoke covering the field, reducing visibility for both sides. In confused fighting, DeKalb leads a charge forward. In the fray, he receives his 11th bayonet or musket blow of the day, and finally falls, mortally wounded. The Delaware Regiment has stood its ground bravely, but in the process, 2/3 of the regiment are becoming casualties. With the Continental cavalry and militia in full retreat and what's left of the army surrounded, Cornwallis now plays his trump card. The smoke has been screening British dragoons, who are now freely roaming the field. Tarleton's British Legion are ordered to charge into what's left of the Continentals, and with this fresh assault to the rear, the Maryland and Delaware lines are finally broken. Unlike General Howe before him, Cornwallis now orders a pursuit, and the British cavalry harry the retreating Continentals for some 22 miles. By the evening, both the battlefield and roads north are strewn with casualties. The Continentals have suffered at least 900 dead and wounded, and another 1,000 captured in a decisive defeat. The British have taken over 300 casualties, which, although much lower, still represents 15% of the army. And with no sign of reinforcements, Cornwallis is acutely aware that these men will be difficult to replace. After the battle, Gates makes little effort to regroup his army. That includes warning a militia force under Thomas Sumter of the defeat, who had been successfully harassing supply lines in the British rear. At Fishing Creek, Tarleton and his British Legion catch up to Sumter's force and in short order kill or capture another 450 men. Gates's short-lived campaign has turned into a debacle and the second major continental defeat in the South after Charlestown. Gates, being an ex-British Army officer of 24 years, had knowingly pitched his militia against the best British troops on the field, revealing either a grave misjudgment or severe negligence. Despite the victory, the British are unable to capitalise in the following weeks, and they are again plagued by yet further Loyalist defeats. Despite controlling the major towns in South Carolina, the countryside still remains deeply contested. For Gates, he will be dismissed in October and finally replaced in December. To further his own ambitions, Gates had often advocated for rival officers to be court-martialed, including Benedict Arnold after the Battle of Saratoga in an attempt to undermine his reputation. But now that he was in the firing line, Gates would vehemently oppose a brewing inquiry. Many of his contemporaries were appalled by Gates's actions, including Washington himself, and although Gates would survive the eventual court-martial, he would never again command an army in the field. Despite Cornwallis's ongoing problems with partisans, with the Continentals vanquished once more, he now plans a major push into North Carolina for the following spring. He gathers his army and moves to Charlotte, where he hopes to establish a base for recruiting Loyalists, resupplying his forces, and preparing for next year's campaign. Major Ferguson, leading Loyalist forces in the South, personally commands a force of over 1,000 men. Ferguson is a bold and charismatic officer and perhaps the best marksman in the British Army, even having invented his own rifle. But he is also deeply conventional in his tactics and approach to warfare. At the Battle of Brandywine years earlier, he had refused to shoot George Washington despite having a clear shot because the idea of shooting an unsuspecting officer had disgusted him. Ferguson and his Loyalist militia had been making good progress on the border of North and South Carolina, and by the end of the summer, virtually all Patriot forces had been dispersed in the area. In September, they moved 70 miles west of Cornwallis to start recruiting in North Carolina and protect the British left. While there, Ferguson releases a prisoner on parole with a warning message to local patriots. He threatens to hang their leadership and lay waste to the countryside unless they submit to British rule. The message is taken as a direct challenge, and within weeks, 900 Patriot horsemen, the Over-Mountain men, are rallied and on their way to answer it. Ferguson is aware of the Patriot force, but he only slowly moves towards Cornwallis in Charlotte, perhaps underestimating his opponents, or more likely because he is hopeful for a battle. The Patriots, happy to oblige, are kept informed of the Loyalist position by locals and begin to close the distance. Ferguson and his men are just one day's march away from Charlotte, but instead of moving east and to safety, they pause and camp on top of Kings Mountain. Kings Mountain is a large hill rising some 60 feet, with a mostly flat and open top, 600 yards long. Some Loyalists, including Ferguson, are on the high ground to the south, while the majority of the men are camped on flatter ground to the east. Ferguson has posted pickets around the hill, but he has made no effort to fortify the encampment. The Loyalists are made up of 1,000 Georgian and Carolinian militiamen and 100 provincials from New York wearing scarlet uniforms. As the day passes on October 7th, the men clean their weapons and rest in the camp as light rain drizzles around them. The Patriot militia, made up of frontiersmen from the Carolinas and Virginia, arrive in the area and stumble upon a recently paroled prisoner. Hearing the state and disposition of the Loyalists, they tie up their horses and move to surround the hill. At 3 p.m. on the north side, the frontiersmen start the battle by yelling out a fierce Indian war cry. Some of the loyalist pickets have been silently killed before they could raise the alarm, leaving Ferguson's men shocked to hear the enemy so close. Drums roll, and the loyalists quickly scramble to form battle lines in the clearing around the camp. But they are not on an open field like at Camden, or facing a drawn-up, professional opponent. The mountainside is thick with foliage and trees in all directions, covering the Patriot approach, who first start reaching the high ground on the southern side. All around Kings Mountain, there is soon an eruption of fire, smoke, and cries of battle. The Loyalist ranks volley fire and then charge with bayonets, running through any Patriots that hold their ground. But most of the Patriots move quickly around their enemy and rally near the bottom, stopping any pursuing Loyalists dead in their tracks with fierce rifle fire. On the north side, the Patriots use the natural cover to fire into the Loyalist lines. The Loyalists are easy targets, and their returning volley fire is of little use against the frontiersmen moving behind trees. Gaps are beginning to show, and some Patriot units sporadically break into the camp in bloody hand-to-hand fighting. The Loyalists on the high ground, now surrounded, fall back to the main camp, where many of their comrades are starting to fall out of formation and instead fire behind wagons, tents, and any cover they can find. They have some success in counter-attacking with bayonets, driving the Patriots back at least 3 times, and almost routing some groups who are cut down or fall off cliffs trying to escape. But as soon as the Loyalists move back up the hill, they are followed and picked off one by one. Soon the Loyalist ranks start to thin and morale plummets. Ferguson, although already wounded, is continuously riding between his men on a white horse and coolly issuing orders. As the situation continues to rapidly deteriorate, he orders his cavalry to mount for an attack. But no sooner than saddling their horses, the men are shot down by accurate rifle fire from the tree lines. The Loyalists are being overwhelmed, and a white flag is raised, only for Ferguson to ride over and tear it down. A second white flag is raised and torn down once more. Ferguson's men have taken heavy losses and now implore him to surrender. But he refuses and instead rallies what men he can and attempts to break out with a charge. As they push through the Patriot lines on horseback, cutting and slashing with their swords, they are, in short order, shot down to the man. Ferguson receives 7 rifle balls to his body, with a great many more holes in his hat and clothing. His body will soon be stripped, and by some accounts, even urinated on. Loyalist bodies are now lying in heaps from near point-blank fire, and a soldier is sent out with a white flag, asking to surrender. He is promptly shot, and despite pleas for quarter, the firing does not stop for some time, with many seeking revenge for Tarleton's actions at Waxhaw. The firing eventually dies down, but a Loyalist foraging party returns and the fighting briefly resumes. The Patriots are fearful of British reinforcements and that their new prisoners will escape. In the brief final action, up to 100 more Loyalists are killed, some by summary execution. Roughly 300 Loyalists have been killed in the immediate fighting, but another 150 would soon perish, as the wounded are left to their fates on the mountainside. Almost 700 Loyalist prisoners are force-marched away, and a number would soon be hanged for various charges, including recently switching sides. The battle had been brutal and epitomised the war's Old World tactics against New World individualism. On an open field like Camden, the British reigned supreme, but Kings Mountain and the summer of Loyalist defeats had proven that to be victorious in America, conventional tactics and military might was not enough. Ferguson, despite his brilliance, had made a catalogue of errors, and as a result, By the end of 1780, the Loyalists in the backcountry are now an almost spent military force. For the Patriot cause, news of the battle reverses the prevailing sense of defeat in the South. The victory is exactly what is needed, and militia and Continental ranks soon start to swell. General Cornwallis takes the news badly in Charlotte. Loyalist activity falls to an all-time low, and the countryside soon becomes more dangerous than ever. British foraging parties must now only move in strength, while any lone couriers are dead men riding. With fever sweeping through the army, a move into North Carolina is for now impossible. Left with little choice, on the 14th of October, Cornwallis retreats south to Winnsboro for the winter. For the main Continental Army in the South, still licking its wounds after Camden, some good news is potentially on the way. With Washington's full support, the pragmatic and resourceful Nathanael Greene takes command in early December, and he has plans for a new strategy against the British for the following year in 1781. By the end of 1780, the war is about to enter its 6th bloody year, and both sides are facing significant recruitment, supply, and morale issues. Commanders on both sides feel in perilous positions and write furiously to either Parliament or Congress, demanding more men and resources while complaining about increasingly hostile locals. In the South, and the most active theatre of the war, both armies lick their wounds and prepare for what will soon become the most decisive year of the war in 1781. Through 1780, the war in the north seemed to be at a standstill. Both sides had planned significant operations. The Franco-American coalition hoped to attack New York, while the British considered striking against the French expeditionary forces at Rhode Island, which, owed to its size and mobility, poses a serious threat to British forces across the Americas. But neither plans are realised, despite the bulk of both armies facing off against each other in the north. There is disagreement between Washington and his French counterpart, Count Rochambeau, over strategy, while the commander of British forces, General Clinton, had placed his faith in a conspiracy to capture West Point with the defector Benedict Arnold. Such a coup would have blocked future attacks against New York and made Washington's position in the region precarious. But the plot fails and the deadlock resumes. Back in the South, by December 1780, Brigadier General Nathanael Greene arrives at the Continental camp at Charlotte to finally relieve the disgraced Horatio Gates. Greene is a seasoned commander, having fought with Washington from Boston to Trenton. He was also familiar with his opponent, General Charles Cornwallis, who he had faced at Brandywine, Germantown, and Monmouth. Greene has brought with him other veteran officers, including the highly capable and popular General Daniel Morgan, who had distinguished himself at Quebec and Saratoga. But Greene faces a number of problems. On his way south, he'd received little to no support from state legislators, who claim they have no funds or resources to give. The army he inherits consists of just 1,400 men, many of which are still poorly equipped. To make matters worse, the army has just 3 days' supply of food, and with the continental currency being almost worthless, fresh provisions are increasingly hard to come by. Greene is under orders to wear down the equally resource-strapped British army. This follows Washington's strategy at the dawn of 1781. Conduct a Fabian-style war of attrition while relying on a growing international coalition to force Britain to negotiate. Greene is not yet ready to face the British, who significantly outnumber his army, and he needs time and space to prepare his forces. In late December, just 2 weeks after taking command, Greene takes a bold and controversial decision. Without holding a war council and against classical military judgment, he decides to split his forces. Dividing an army when outnumbered is a huge risk. Greene hopes that by doing so, he can better support the irregulars fighting in the south, while threatening the rear of any British advance north. But this also leaves him vulnerable to be defeated in detail. In late December, Greene begins to move east to build his strength, while feinting an attack against Camden. Daniel Morgan, meanwhile, marches west with 600 Continentals and orders to threaten 96 and other British outposts. Further south, General Cornwallis faces an equally challenging situation. His instructions from Clinton are to pacify the southern states, while keeping General Greene at bay. At this point in the war, the British also hope to wear down their opponent and force Congress to the negotiating table. Both sides perhaps recognise that outright victory is unlikely, and what matters now is developing the strongest hand possible for inevitable peace talks. For the British and General Clinton, successful campaigns in 1781 could ensure that at least New York, Canada, and much of the South remain firmly within the Empire. Through his network of spies, Cornwallis is well aware of Greene's movements and the curious decision to split the Continental Army. Through reinforcements and loyalist recruitment, his army has now grown to almost 10,000 men. But the guerrilla fighting means that he cannot concentrate his army, and instead, he must commit Lord Rawdon and 5,000 troops to garrison a string of forts to fight the growing Patriot irregulars. His main army, meanwhile, of some 3,200 men, are to conduct offensive operations into North Carolina. This is important for Cornwallis, who believes that the guerrilla fighting in South Carolina could be dramatically reduced if the Continentals are pushed further north, thereby cutting critical supplies to the irregulars. A third force of 1,100 men under the aggressive and daring cavalry commander, Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton, is sent to reinforce 96 against a suspected attack by Morgan. In early January, Cornwallis breaks camp and slowly starts moving towards North Carolina and his hopeful confrontation with Greene. Morgan, upon hearing of Tarleton's position, begins moving north to avoid becoming trapped between the two British armies in the field. But Tarleton, under fresh orders to catch and destroy Morgan, is advancing quicker than expected. The British build rafts and bridges to cross a number of rivers in rapid succession and close the gap in a dramatic but exhausting 12-day pursuit. Finally, on the 16th of January, Tarleton's force catches up to Morgan before they are able to cross the now swollen Broad River. So as not to be caught crossing, Morgan camps at Hannah's Cowpens and prepares to make a stand. That evening, Morgan discusses his plan with senior officers. He is well aware of his opponent, Tarleton, and his usually aggressive tactics. He is also aware that the British have no respect for his militia, who have broken time and time again in battle. Morgan has 1,800 to 1,900 men under his command, mostly from the Carolinas and Virginia, including 170 dragoons, 450 Continentals and regulars, and roughly 1,300 militia. For many of the men, they cannot wait to fight the hated bloody Tarleton and his now infamous British Legion. That includes the young Continental cavalry commander, Colonel William Washington, who had been personally defeated by Tarleton twice the previous year and hungers for revenge. Despite their backs against the river, Morgan is confident in his position. He hopes the lack of an escape route will compel his men to fight hard for their very survival. Morgan is also making a shrewd strategic calculation. He knows Tarleton is hunting him and that Cornwallis is nearby, only 2 days' march away. By fighting today, he at least chooses the field with a well-rested and supplied army, a luxury he may not have if the retreat continues. Throughout the night, he walks the camp, encouraging his men and giving detailed instructions for the next day. Morgan also organizes a good breakfast and 24 rounds of ammunition per soldier. Cowpens is a perfect place for a battle, an open meadow with few trees and gently rolling hills. The ground, used for cattle grazing, is also devoid of undergrowth, making it ideal for cavalry movements. Further south, the 26-year-old Bannister Tarleton has been kept well informed of Morgan's position by local loyalists and continental deserters. Desperate to catch up to Morgan, he marches his 1,100 men through the night. Tarleton believes that time is of the essence. If Morgan is allowed to cross the broad river, he may escape completely. Although without sleep and having run out of food 2 days prior, his army is well motivated and trained. Tarleton has a crack force composed of 300 dragoons, 500 regulars including an elite Highland regiment, and almost 300 provincials and militia. Almost half his army are loyalist colonials, including the dreaded and formidable British Legion. At 7 a.m, green-jacketed Legion dragoons begin to slowly emerge from the tree lines. They are soon followed by fast-marching Scarlet infantrymen and Highlanders in their tartan kilts. To Tarleton's sheer delight and surprise, he can just about see the Continentals forming for battle. He knows he has his enemy trapped against the broad river and, without waiting to consult his senior officers or for his full force to arrive, Tarleton orders his army to deploy. In the gloom before daybreak, the British can see little of their enemy. A thin line of men on a ridge, likely skirmishers, appear to mask a main force behind them. Tarleton, hungry for more information on the Continental positions, orders forward 50 Legion dragoons to drive off the skirmishers. As the dragoons charge forward on the center and right, 150 Patriot riflemen from Georgia and the Carolinas start to take aim. Although militia, they have extensive frontier service and know how to handle cavalry. At 50 yards, they open a deadly accurate volley. The dragoons gallop on, but the riflemen do not break as expected and hide behind trees and other obstacles, while shooting down a number of horsemen, eventually forcing them back. As his American cavalry withdraw, unsuccessful in their mission, Tarleton considers his options. With the skirmishers unmoved, he still doesn't have a good view of the main enemy line. He could wait for sunrise and attempt to gather more information, but if the force in front of him is just a rearguard, the pause may give Morgan the time he needs to slip across the river and escape. Predictably, Tarleton makes the decision to attack. Well-drilled Legion and light infantry start the assault on the right, with drums beating and the men shouting battle cries. For most of the militia watching on, it is the first time seeing British regulars, with their customary precision, marching towards them with sharp uniforms and glinting bayonets. On both British flanks there are 50 dragoons, with several hundred more in reserve. As the British approach the skirmisher line, deadly rifle fire begins to take its toll, particularly among officers who are being targeted to reduce British command and control. The British for the most part hold their fire and use the threat of their bayonets to push back the riflemen, who slowly withdraw in good order to the line behind them. As the advance continues, a militia line of 1,300 men soon becomes fully visible, stationed at the bottom of the slope. Both commanders are with their men, Morgan moving between his militia cracking jokes, while Tarleton is in the front ranks shouting his men on. The fast-moving British line soon comes within 50 yards of the militia, who open fire. Losses, particularly among British officers, are horrific, with 2/3 of some companies becoming casualties. The British stubbornly continue to close another 15 yards before returning fire of their own. But the British tend to overshoot targets, a problem made worse when firing downhill, and the musket balls mostly fly over the militia's heads. Although their fire is ineffective, the bayonet charge that follows it is not. As the regulars surge forward, across the line, the militia gives way after firing once. Except on the left, where, just before the British light infantry are able to close, a second devastating volley is released, throwing the regulars back. But the militia eventually gives way nonetheless, and, despite the high casualties, the British can now sense victory and start to charge out of rank up the next hill in pursuit. To Tarleton, the collapse of the Continental militia signals a total rout, and dragoons are quickly dispatched to seal the day. But as the main British line reaches the crest of the hill, to their shock, a third line of infantry suddenly becomes visible. The Continental regulars, in their blue and white uniforms with bayonets gleaming, are formed up and waiting for them. More concerning still for the British, instead of dispersing in all directions as usual, the militia is pouring through gaps in the third line and reorganizing as if pre-planned. Stunned British officers, only moments earlier certain of victory, quickly scramble to hold and then reform their men. Without much delay, the now bruised British line is soon reorganized and at the Continentals, as both sides begin firing volleys. At the same time, 800 militiamen are catching their breath behind the safety of the fresh Continental line. As officers shout at their men to begin reforming, disaster strikes. British dragoons have broken through the Continental left and are now charging at full gallop over a small hill and directly into the militia. The attack comes out of nowhere, and within seconds, dragoons are slashing their way through the mass of panicked troops, who start to scatter. This is a disaster for Morgan. A rout behind his main line could quickly spread and end the battle in defeat. Further to the rear, commanding the Continental Cavalry, Colonel William Washington has been ordered to respond to both crisis and opportunity. Seeing the militia in flight, he has immediately moved forward to counterattack. Now it was the turn of the British to be caught off guard, as the white-coated Continental Dragoons waste no time in engaging their counterparts. A bloody melee ensues, but the British, outnumbered and disorganized, are quickly overwhelmed. Almost half the British Dragoons are soon cut down, while the rest retreat for their lives. Morgan too is able to stop the militia from routing, as he rides in front of them, waving his sword and crying out to rally. Disaster has been narrowly averted. On the main line, volleys are still being exchanged as the nerve of both armies is pushed to the limit. Officers are in the thick of the fighting, including Tarleton and soon Morgan, inspiring their men to fight on. To break the deadlock, Tarleton moves to envelop the Continental right. It is now the turn of his Highland reserves, and a new sound is added to the battlefield. Bagpipes open as the Scots advance on the left. To counter the new threat, the Continental right is ordered to wheel around and face their enemy. But in the confusion of battle, the orders are misunderstood. Instead, the Virginians start marching to the rear, followed by most of the Continental line. But it is not a rout, and cohesion is maintained. For the British infantry, exhausted but unbroken, seeing the back of their enemy gives them renewed confidence. Without orders, a spontaneous bayonet charge erupts across the line as men rush forward with cries of victory. But the Continental movements have been misunderstood. As the Highlanders get within 10 yards, the Continentals have turned and fire a devastating volley that kills or wounds almost half the regiment. A counter bayonet charge immediately follows, supported by Colonel Washington's cavalry, who charged the British flank. Breaking Highlanders is no mean feat, and the Scots desperately fight on. The melee is bloody, but increasingly isolated, and with the reformed militia now joining the fight against them, the unthinkable soon occurs, and the 71st Highlanders break. With the collapse of the left, the rest of the now exhausted British line can do no more, and whole units either begin surrendering on the spot or running for their lives. British artillery fire on, refusing to surrender, and true to their code of honour, they are all killed or wounded to the man, protecting their guns. Tarleton, not wanting to believe the battle lost, implores his Legion Dragoons, still in reserve, to counterattack. But seeing the writing on the wall, they uncharacteristically refuse his orders, turn about, and abruptly leave the field. Tarleton, not giving up, is able to rally other cavalry and soon charges in a desperate final gambit. Colonel Washington's cavalry soon meet them, and in the brief struggle, force them back. Amongst the chaos, Washington spots Tarleton riding away with several officers, and immediately gallops straight after his nemesis. Tarleton turns, charges back to face him, and a swirling duel of horses and sabres begins. In the collision, Washington's sword is broken by a Legion officer, but he is saved first by his servant, who shoots the officer, and then by a friendly sergeant who blocks another blow. Tarleton himself next swings, but Washington parries with the hilt of his sabre. In the desperate and furious melee, lasting just seconds, Tarleton draws a pistol and fires, missing Washington by inches. After lightly firing the last shot of the battle, Tarleton gallops away, fleeing south with his legion. In less than an hour, the battle was over, and Tarleton had lost almost 90% of his army, including over 300 killed and wounded, and 700 prisoners, compared to relatively light Continental casualties. Morgan had faced a deadly foe, and in stark contrast to the Battle of Camden, he had masterfully understood his enemy's confidence and aggression, and used it against them. The evening before, Morgan had made it clear to his men that he intended to draw the British in and exhaust them over 3 lines of battle. Everyone therefore understood their role and knew not to panic when seeing friendly units retreating. Morgan had skillfully turned the inevitable withdrawal of the militia, as they had done time and again previously, to an integral part of his plan and bait for the British. Tarleton, perhaps the most hated man in the South, had been thoroughly outgeneraled. Although a brilliant cavalry captain, he had shown an inability to command larger forces, pushing his small army to breaking point before the battle had even started, and then failing to understand his enemy before attacking. 25 miles away, Cornwallis, learning of the defeat, swears revenge and readies his main army to march north in pursuit. But the damage to British control of the South will soon be felt, as support for the Patriot cause continues to grow. With all on the line, Cowpens is the first domino to fall in a year of increasingly decisive battles. On the morning of the 18th of January 1781, and one day after the Battle of Cowpens, an exhausted and defeated Colonel Banastre Tarleton rides into British General Cornwallis's camp. All eyes watch as he approaches his furious commander and explains, perhaps ashamed, that General Morgan and the Continentals have not only defeated him, but captured close to 1,000 men. Cornwallis is left in disbelief. His campaign is already not going to plan. So far, victories have been indecisive, while defeats are increasingly disastrous. and now Cowpens reduces his field army to just 2,500 men, with the rest of his forces tied down fighting partisans across South Carolina and Georgia. In New York, General Clinton, Commander-in-Chief of British forces, is growing concerned about the situation and instructs Cornwallis to be on the defensive, consolidating his forces while avoiding costly inland campaigns and any further disasters. Clinton and Lord Germain in London fully understand that outright victory in the war is unlikely, and now, ahead of anticipated peace talks, believe that they must concentrate their efforts on securing as much territory in the lucrative South as possible. But Cornwallis vehemently disagrees with Clinton's more passive strategy and believes that his only chance of victory in the South is to find and defeat the Continental Army, while expanding British control into North Carolina to reduce Continental supplies being sent south to the partisans. The next day, on the 19th of January, Cornwallis, eager to strike while his enemy is divided, sets out on a campaign that will make or break British control in the South. General Morgan, fresh from his tactical masterstroke against Tarleton, has also started moving his army. He plans for a delaying action and marches to cover the Catawba River. Although initially leading from the front in his usual style, Morgan's health has taken a significant turn for the worse. Plagued by chronic illnesses, he is soon bedbound in camp, to his deep frustration. General Greene, meanwhile, commanding Continental forces in the South, has over 2,000 men, including 1,400 regulars and some 800 militia. However, his army has been shrinking as militia enlistments end and men go home, despite Greene's pleas for them to stay. Splitting his army weeks earlier had been a gamble that paid off well at Cowpens. But now, and after hearing of Cornwallis's advance, he starts moving to reunite with Morgan and present a united front. His orders from his commander-in-chief, General Washington, are to exhaust the British in a war of attrition, avoid costly defeats, and crush Loyalist resolve in the South. Against General Clinton's wishes, Cornwallis is now marching deep into the inhospitable forests, swamps, and muddy roads of the Carolinas backcountry. He aims to find and defeat Greene, or at least force him over the Dan River and out of North Carolina. With the January rains, the march is miserable and the British struggle to keep track of their enemy. At Cowpens, Cornwallis had lost the majority of his light troops, who typically act as the army's eyes and ears. He is left with mostly regiments of the line, deadly on the battlefield, but not used to the kind of lightning advances that Cornwallis is hoping for. Desperate to increase the speed of his army, Cornwallis now takes a radical step, and one perhaps even more unorthodox than Greene's decision to split his army months earlier. Cornwallis burns his baggage train. Everything non-essential is thrown on a huge fire, including tents, wagons, excess food, clothing, and even the army's cherished rum supplies, leaving the soldiers cold, wet, and to their horror, sober. Whatever the army needed would now be carried on their backs. Cornwallis sets the example by burning his personal effects, including fine china, silverware, and wine. These actions are unprecedented and sends a clear message, epitomized by a senior officer. It was resolved that we would follow Greene's army to the end of the world. What would soon be called the Race to the Dan had begun. By the 30th of January, Greene and Morgan finally reunite their forces. A war council is held on the banks of the Catawba River, and as they talk, Cornwallis is seen on the opposite bank, watching on through a spyglass. The situation is tense, and Greene fears he does not have the strength to stop the British fording one of the many crossing points along the river. The decision is made for the Continentals to retreat to Salisbury, while the 800-strong militia under General Davidson is to stay and fight a delaying action if the British attempt to cross. In the early hours of the 1st of February, a fog hangs over Cowpens Ford, which stretches 500 yards from bank to bank. The British Army, with unloaded muskets, creeps slowly into the river. Cornwallis is at the front, while Patriot sentries sleep at their posts in the distance. The water gets to chest height as the regulars cross, and the fast current soon sweeps unlucky men away. As the British get midstream, the sound of drowning men is finally heard by shocked sentries, and the alarm is raised. Within minutes, a torrent of fire is unleashed into the crossing mass of redcoats. Cornwallis's horse is hit several times, along with a number of his men. Patriot General Davidson arrives and surveys the scene, encouraging his men and organising the defences. Soon, the British are desperately scrambling up the riverbank and returning fire of their own in chaotic close-quarter fighting. In the confusion, Davidson is shot dead from his horse. His loss quickly puts the militia to flight, ending the battle prematurely and enabling the British to cross. The attack had been daring by Cornwallis and could well have ended in disaster. It is also lightly costly. He reports just 40 casualties, but the real number is no doubt higher. A troubling start for his small army. As the British column moves forward, both armies are now racing to the next major river, the Yadkin, on roads thick with mud thanks to the near constant torrential rain. Both sides suffer greatly in the miserable conditions. On the march, British and German soldiers burn a number of houses, and with Tarleton's legion menacing the area, Greene's militiamen start to abandon the army to find their families. Despite being further behind, the British soon catch up, but not before Greene is able to make the dangerous crossing by boat, and once again, the two generals face off across a swollen river. As the British look for a safe ford to cross, the Continentals arrive at Guilford Court House. There, the highly capable Daniel Morgan, with his ailments getting worse, finally leaves the army for home. A severe loss for Greene. To make matters worse, the Patriot militia is continuing to evaporate, accelerated by news of Cornwallis's approach. Outnumbered and outclassed, Greene makes the difficult decision to continue the retreat. A fresh and final race soon begins to the Dan River, where Tarleton and his opposite number, Light Horse Harry Lee, spar off on the roads north. In minor skirmishes, Lee's legion hold off the British, while screening the direction of Greene's retreat. Cornwallis pushes his army hard and almost to breaking point, even marching through the night, desperate to get ahead of the Continentals. The Dan River is wide, and the British rightly assume that any crossing will be a difficult and timely affair. But Greene's relentless planning and attention to detail is about to pay off. Days earlier, Greene had ordered that boats be massed at Irwin's Ferry, which he now promptly uses to cross the river and escape into Virginia. Just hours later, Cornwallis arrives to see his enemy once again on the opposite side of a riverbank. A crushing sight for his men after marching an impressive 40 miles in 31 hours. Their only problem was, the Continentals had done it in 20. With the Continentals across the Dan, the British were now at least the only remaining army in North Carolina. But in 17 days, they had been drawn in over 250 miles, lost almost 500 men, and only directly controlled a small portion of the territory. Exhausted and hungry, Cornwallis moves to Hillsborough to arrest and recruit local militias. While the Continentals enjoy well-organized supplies in Virginia, discipline starts to rapidly break down in the British camp. Soldiers break off to steal food or whiskey, despite severe threats from Cornwallis to stop. The looting makes the army unpopular, severely damaging recruitment efforts. Yet Greene's position is far from perfect. Although his Continentals have remained in good spirits, his militia has shrunk to less than 100, and he knows the British predicament will slowly improve if unchallenged. Local Tories would eventually mobilise, and supplies from the Royal Navy arrive. To keep Patriot hopes alive in North Carolina, Light Horse Harry and his legion quietly slip back across the Dan River. On the afternoon of the 25th of February, 400 local loyalists have responded to Cornwallis's requests and gathered to join the British. As they march, they are on the lookout for Tarleton and his legion, who have been ordered to escort them to Hillsborough. Ahead on the road, the green-jacketed cavalrymen appear, and cheers soon erupt. Relieved to see the famed Tarleton, friendly banter and cries of "God save the King" ring out as the cavalry move alongside the loyalists, who salute and compliment the militia in return as they slowly ride past. But all is not as it seems. Unfortunately for the North Carolinian loyalists, Light Horse Harry's legion also wear green jackets and have been moving across the backcountry pretending to be Tarleton's legion for days now. What followed was quick and bloody. Without warning, Lee's dragoons wheel around and charge their loyalist countrymen with sabres and pistols. Within minutes, almost 100 stunned men are cut down dead, many begging for mercy from who they still believe to be allies and friends. The action is soon over, and the survivors flee to their homes. Later that evening, a number of loyalist prisoners would be murdered, with cries of "Remember Buford," continuing the never-ending cycle of violence and retaliation in civil war. Pyle's massacre, as it would soon be known, would have disastrous consequences for the British. Unlike the Battle of Waxhaws a year earlier, where Colonel Buford's Continentals were similarly cut down by Tarleton's legion, this action would have the opposite effect. Whereas Waxhaw had inflamed Patriot passions and rallied support, Pyle's massacre does the reverse. Loyalist morale is devastated, and further recruitment halted overnight. On the 22nd of February, Greene recrosses the Dan in force. For the next 3 weeks, the two generals once again play cat and mouse in North Carolina. But this time, Greene's army is growing. With arriving reinforcements, he soon has almost 1,800 Continentals and 2,600 militia, compared to Cornwallis's 2,000 regulars and provincials. Feeling finally ready to confront his enemy, Greene moves back to Guilford Court House, where only weeks earlier he had carefully examined the ground. As the British arrive, the cavalries once again skirmish ahead of the main bodies. The fighting is indecisive, but Tarleton loses several fingers during the encounter. The scene is finally set for a decisive battle in North Carolina.
Hey there, Vero 311, former Marine infantryman, Revolutionary War reenactor, and amateur history enthusiast. And let's start this video.
Today I'm going to run through how the Continental and British militaries were organized and fought during the American Revolutionary War. At the start of 1775, there was no unified military force representing all 13 colonies. Instead, individual colonies, especially those in New England, raised their own regiments in response to the battles of Lexington and Concord. These regiments formed a loosely organized force known as the Army of Observation. It was this ad hoc army that surrounded the British in Boston during the spring and early summer of 1775. In June of 1775, the Second Continental Congress formally brought together the various colonial militias into a single force known as the Continental Army. Appointing George Washington as its commander-in-chief, this marked the official creation of a unified American army. The name Continental Army reflected its purpose to defend not just one colony or region, but all 13 colonies as a unified front. Unlike the regionally focused local militias, the Continental Army was a national force, raised by Congress designed to fight across the entire continent. And it did, from the frozen gates of Quebec to the swamps of Florida. It was this army that fought directly in opposition to British rule. But in its infancy, this army had a variety of problems to overcome. Enlistments were short, typically lasting only until the end of the calendar year. As a result, just as soldiers were beginning to grasp the basics of soldiering and how to operate effectively as a unit, their terms expired and thousands of trained men left the ranks. To Washington's great frustration, he had to rebuild the army year after year with inexperienced recruits. In September of 1776, Congress adopted Washington's proposal for a standing army of 88 regiments, with soldiers enlisted for 3 years or the duration of the war. This was a turning point. Though states still struggled to meet quotas and recruitment remained uneven, it provided Washington and Continental commanders like Nathanael Greene with a more dependable core of veteran soldiers who could be trained, retrained, and relied upon across multiple campaigns. Further reforms followed in 1778 and 1779. During the harsh winter at Valley Forge, Baron von Steuben introduced standardized drills and procedures. His Blue Book revolutionized training, standardized movements, improved musket handling by simplifying the drill, and enforcing discipline, marking a major milestone to the creation of a professional fighting force. By 1780, financial pressures and a shortage of manpower forced another reorganization. The army was reduced to 50 regiments of about 500 men each. Specialist roles like light infantry, engineers, and combined armed legions were introduced, creating a smaller but more versatile force. The British Army, by contrast, was a well-organized machine at the outbreak of the war, and, contrary to popular opinion, was well prepared to fight a less than traditional war in the backwoods of North America. General Howe had written a light infantry manual in 1774, attaching a light company to each regiment, specifically for skirmishing, guerrilla warfare, and independent movement. Numbers fluctuated throughout the war, but approximately half of the entire British Army was deployed to the Americas. At its height, some 35,000 men across the 13 colonies in Canada. This meant that for much of the war, the British could field twice the amount of regulars than the Continentals. Throughout the war, the British Army was an adaptable force suited for warfare in North America, with General Clinton in particular creating a greater emphasis on light infantry and flexible operations. The British also made use of German auxiliaries throughout the war, referred to by the Americans as Hessians, even though they came from a variety of German states. These German formations were full of professional soldiers. British combat power was also supplemented by units of Americans who stayed loyal to the king, though often underappreciated, these American loyalists would spend the war fighting their fellow countrymen. Now let's talk regiments in particular. This administrative and fighting unit was the backbone of every 18th century army. Regiments at full strength were typically 500 to 700 men strong, but the realities of attrition on campaigning could dwindle the regiment down to a few hundred men. The regiment was a soldier's home, identity, and primary formation on the battlefield. Each regiment usually consisted of a single battalion, the tactical unit that maneuvered and fought as a whole during combat. 2 to 4 regiments or battalions could be grouped together to form a brigade, usually formed for ad hoc missions and led by a brigadier general. A major general may then control a wing or a large operational force, while a lieutenant general could oversee an entire theater of war, second only to the commander-in-chief, the most senior rank in the army. During the war, British and Continental regiments functioned in the same way. Both were led by a colonel, or more typically, a lieutenant colonel in the British Army. Each company was typically led by a captain who was supported by a lieutenant and then an ensign, 2 sergeants, 3 corporals, 1 drummer, and around 60 privates. Each regiment typically contained 8 line and 2 flank companies, 1 flank company of grenadiers, the other light infantry. The line companies functioned as the disciplined core of the regiment, trained to deliver volleys in formation and hold the main battle line during engagements. On the battlefield, a regiment would deploy in companies in a row of some 200 feet long and 2 men deep. The men would rarely be shoulder to shoulder and more typically formed in an open order about an arm's length apart. The grenadiers would be made up of the tallest and strongest of the regiment and were used as elite shock troops in the field. Light companies would be made up of the fittest men of the regiment and were used for reconnaissance, skirmishing, and ambushing. They were often trained on individual accuracy and wore trimmed down uniforms. In North America, it wasn't uncommon for these flank companies to be grouped together to form a new light or grenadier battalion, creating elite or specialized formations. British line infantry were commonly armed with the 10-pound land pattern 75 caliber smoothbore military flintlock musket, better known today as the Brown Bess. Fitted with a bayonet lug that also functioned as a front sight, this iconic British firearm would remain in service well into the 19th century. Continental soldiers, by contrast, lacked uniformity in arms and carried a wide variety of muskets. These included locally produced arms, captured British arms, and imported muskets from France, Spain, and the Netherlands. The most significant supplier was France, providing over 100,000 infantry muskets during the war. Firing either musket required a practiced, multi-step loading process, and with proper drill, a trained soldier could deliver up to 3 rounds a minute in combat. To maximize the effectiveness of a musket, commanders aimed to hold fire until the enemy was within roughly 50 yards. Although skirmishing and exchanges often began at greater distances, leaders like Washington cautioned against throwing away your fire at too early or too great of a distance. If troops could hold their fire until a closer range, you had a better chance of delivering a devastating first volley. Once firing began, thick clouds of black powder smoke obscured visibility and the deafening noise disrupted command and control. Soldiers often began firing independently, creating a continuous, yet disorganized barrage of gunfire. It was in this confusion that drummers and large regimental flags became vital tools, helping maintain order, relay commands, and keep units together amidst the smoke and noise. This is also where the experience of a unit would pay off large dividends for their commanders. Other specialized units like cavalry were adapted to the tough terrain of North America. Lighter and more flexible dragoon units were especially useful. These were troops trained to fight on horseback, and they were often used for reconnaissance, raiding, patrolling, and skirmishing. Both sides also fielded mixed units that combined infantry and cavalry. Leaders like Light Horse Harry Lee, father of future Confederate General Robert E. Lee, and the British officer Banastre Tarleton commanded elite legions made up of fast-moving, motivated dragoons and light infantry. These legions could operate independently, move fast through rough terrain, launch surprise ambushes on foot, or deliver sudden saber charges on horseback, making them a serious threat on the battlefield. Artillery was typically deployed in batteries between 2 and 6 guns, positioned to disrupt enemy formations and support infantry advances. The most common field pieces were smoothbore guns, ranging from 3 to 12 pounders. This unit of measurement is referring to the weight of the solid shot that they fired. These guns typically fired solid round shot, heavy iron balls used to smash through enemy lines, batter fortifications, or ricochet across open ground to cause maximum disruption. At closer range, they could be loaded with canister or grape shot, anti-personnel rounds packed with small iron balls that scattered on firing, cutting down anyone in their path. So that will wrap up the overview of how the armies were organized, equipped, and fought during the American Revolutionary War. It's interesting to see how the Continental Army evolves throughout the entire war. At the beginning, it is really built around that nucleus in New England, but by the end of the war, it is full of professional soldiers that are in the duration for the length of the war. There is a lot of problems with this Continental Army all the way till the end. There are problems with pay. There's even a mutiny in 1781, but those are stories for another day. If you want to see more content focused, particularly on the firearms, check out my channel, Revere 0311. And I love doing deep dives into historical pieces such as this. This is an original French infantry musket, a model 1766, and it even has the initials of the soldier carved into the buttstock. If you want to see other videos of me shooting reproductions, in which I shoot single ball, double ball, and I test out different buck and ball loadouts, again, check out the video. Again, thank you to Tristan from History Rebels for allowing me to be part in this video, and now back to the much better narrator. Take care.
At Guilford Court House, the Continental Army rises early on the 15th of March, 1781. Eats its breakfast, and deploys to the battlefield. General Greene has decided to borrow from Morgan's success at Cowpens, deploying his army in 3 lines. The first contains his least reliable troops, about 1,500 North Carolinian militiamen, many of them raw, stationed behind a fence looking across an open field. To support the nervous men, Greene places 200 riflemen and cavalry units on either flank, with artillery in the center. His second line in thick woods comprises the Virginia militia, who, despite having seen action before, are untrusted after their shameful retreat at Camden the previous year. Their commander, Brigadier General Stevens, is determined that this will not happen again, and he places 40 picked riflemen behind the line, with orders to shoot any man that runs. Greene's third and main line sits in a clearing, comprising 1,500 Continentals, with regiments from Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. At 1:30 in the afternoon, the British Army slowly becomes visible, having marched 12 miles that morning to the sound of drums and Highland bagpipes. Cornwallis believes he faces 10,000 men. He cannot see most of his enemy, and he is ignorant of the terrain, but he moves his 2,000 men forward nonetheless. The army is tattered and without breakfast, but after marching hundreds of miles, they are utterly determined to meet the Continentals. As the British steadily move forward, the nerve of the North Carolinian militia is about to be tested. As the anticipation increases, the supporting cannon is withdrawn to the third line. The militia have orders to fire twice, and then retire in good order. As the British come within range, the volleys begin, with somewhat sporadic but deadly accuracy. The British are moving slower than planned through the muddy field and pause to return fire before turning to their bayonets. By this point, many in the militia have fired twice, while some not at all. Regardless, it was now time to leave. The line withdraws, except for the riflemen on the wings, but unlike at Cowpens, there would be no rallying the majority of the men, who flee in all directions. The British push on, dispatching units to drive off the riflemen and their now deadly enfilade fire. As the main line begins to enter the thick woods in front of them, their formations lose cohesion. They are soon at the second line of Virginians, and the battle becomes increasingly confused as both sides trade volleys. 2 Virginian regiments collapse early on the right, but many keep fighting in small groups of men. Commanders on both sides are in the thick of the fighting, and Stevens is hit in the leg and carried from the field. Cornwallis too has his horse shot from under him, and at one point finds himself alone in no man's land, being luckily rescued by a nearby sergeant. For For the most part, the Virginians put up stiff resistance, as the fighting descends into a series of skirmishes from small groups of men, slugging it out in dense woods. Although the Virginians are slowly forced to retreat, many have fired 15 to 20 shots, leaving ground now littered with the dead and dying. Their commanders, including Stevens, no doubt proud to finally put the shame of Camden behind them. With the second line mostly broken, some British regiments now start to slowly emerge from the woodline. A few hundred yards ahead of them, they can see the blue-coated Continentals in good order waiting for them. The British left, light infantry and German Jaegers do not hesitate or wait for reinforcements and immediately charge up to face them. The British battle line is in complete disarray and the attack is unsupported and vulnerable. The Continental veterans hold their fire, waiting patiently until the British are within 30 yards. The volley is devastating, and the British commander, Brigadier General Webster, is hit, mortally wounded, along with many of his men, who now start to waver and step back. At this critical moment, the battle hangs in the balance, with victory possible for either side. Greene may well have been tempted to launch a counterattack and hit his divided and wounded opponent. Such a move could shatter the British or put his own army to flight. Greene does not roll the dice and instead holds his commanding position. With the pause, the cream of Cornwallis's army, the Second Guards, have cleared the woods and are now marching quickly to aid their comrades. The elite guards, without stopping to fire, are soon moving up on the right and closing against the fresh recruits of the 2nd Maryland Regiment. Relying on bayonets alone is a risk, particularly against fellow regulars, as Webster had just discovered on the left. But this time the terrifying speed of the guards has its planned effect, and without firing a shot, the 2nd Marylanders break. Upon seeing their sister regiment retreat, the veteran 1st Marylanders turn and engage the guards. Soon, muzzle to muzzle, ferocious volleys are exchanged. The fighting intensifies in bloody deadlock between perhaps the two best formations in each army. Amongst the smoke and chaos, a cavalry bugle is suddenly heard. Like at Cowpens, Lieutenant Colonel William Washington has been waiting patiently for an opportunity, and his dragoons now swing behind the isolated guards, charging through their ranks with slashing sabers. The guards are left disjointed and shocked, but not yet broken. As the dragoons wheel around to make another pass, they are joined by the 1st Maryland Regiment, who surge forward with bayonets. The hand-to-hand fighting is intense, and in the shouting, stabbing, and clubbing, the Guards' Lieutenant Colonel is killed by a Maryland captain in a bloody duel. Both sides fight on. Cornwallis has been watching in horror for several minutes from the tree line, and well understands the danger. His most elite regiment will be slaughtered if they break down the hill, which may well lead to a general collapse like at Cowpens. Accounts vary with what happens next, but it is likely that Cornwallis, without hesitating and ignoring protesting officers, orders his artillery to fire grape shot at the mass of struggling soldiers on the hill. The cannons roar to the dismay of onlookers, and men on both sides are struck down. Although a difficult decision, the grape shot has the intended effect. Both sides scatter back to their own lines. For Cornwallis, the danger has passed, and with reinforcements ready, he prepares a fresh assault. Greene, however, conscious of keeping his army together and wary of another continental defeat, now moves to disengage and pulls his army back in good order, ending the battle. The British had won the day, and the army had performed bravely in taking the field against a force twice its size. But at what cost and to what end? The British had taken over 500 casualties, more than a quarter of the army, and some of their best troops had taken the brunt of it, the Second Guards alone taking 50% casualties. Continental losses are reported at 263 dead and wounded, although these figures were often underestimated, particularly for the militia. Nevertheless, Greene has kept the bulk of his army intact while leaving the British in a fragile position. Cornwallis had repeatedly rolled the dice to finally get the showdown and victory he craved, leaving him as the apparent master of the Carolinas. After the battle, he moves back to Hillsborough and claims that North Carolina is under British control. But in reality, Cornwallis's victory has been Pyrrhic. In less than 6 months, his field army had shrunk from some 4,500 men to now less than 1,500 fit to fight. Burning his supplies had left his men permanently hungry and forced to plunder local farms, while any hope of a loyalist resurgence had been decimated. Worse still, the campaign had done nothing to stop supplies moving south to the partisans, as little of the province is under practical British control. In Hillsborough, after 3 weeks of next to no local support or supplies, Cornwallis is finally forced to abandon the backcountry and marches, vanquished, to Wilmington and the coast to refit and resupply with the Royal Navy. Although Greene had suffered a tactical battlefield defeat, he had succeeded strategically in the campaign, achieving all his objectives and chiefly exhausting the British army. Although some would criticize the retreat across North Carolina, and for not counterattacking during the battle, Greene has set the stage and a strong foundation for future success. By April, Greene cautiously shadows his opponent towards the coast, while his eye begins to turn to the now vulnerable south. It is the 31st of August, 1781. British General Charles Cornwallis looks out from his growing fortifications at Yorktown, across the broad waters of the Chesapeake Bay. In front of him lies an imposing sight, a French fleet newly arrived and anchoring offshore. The presence of so many ships is alarming, but Cornwallis remains calm. He is dug in well on a peninsula, and his avenue for escape remains wide open, with just a small continental force under the Marquis de Lafayette behind him. Yet within his camp, doubts and rumours are starting to spread. Colonel Bannister Tarleton and other senior officers press their general to strike out now and move inland. Cornwallis, however, hesitates. His commander-in-chief in New York, General Sir Henry Clinton, has promised reinforcements. And although he reassures himself that he can leave at any time, where would he go? Thanks to Continental General Greene, marching back south is no longer an option. And so, for now at least, Cornwallis resolves to stay at Yorktown. As British, German, and Loyalist soldiers dig trenches day and night in the shadows of a growing enemy fleet, many may have started to nervously ask themselves, how did it come to this? Five months earlier, in late March 1781, General Nathaniel Greene's Continental Army, although defeated at Guilford Court House, remains intact and in good spirits. Cornwallis rests in Wilmington after a bruising campaign that has left his army diminished. By ignoring orders from Clinton months earlier, Cornwallis had recently learned the hard way what many other British commanders already understood about the war in North America: that marching inland, chasing rebel armies, leads to ruin. Greene suspects that Cornwallis is now planning a move into Virginia, the largest and richest colony in North America. With that hunch, he plans a shrewd, strategic move. Instead of following Cornwallis, Greene pivots and quickly starts moving south. This leaves Cornwallis in an impossible position. His southern garrisons are vulnerable and already fighting a brutal civil and partisan war. He must either continue to chase Greene in a costly and possibly futile campaign, or shift to a new theatre and strategy, but thereby risking control of the South. Convinced the war cannot be won in the Carolinas, and frustrated by his lack of progress so far, Cornwallis chooses a fresh start and prepares, as Greene anticipated, a move into Virginia. Even without Cornwallis chasing him, Greene's hopes of retaking the South are still precarious. He has some 2,600 men and can rely on perhaps 4,000 local partisans. They face some 8,000 British regulars, provincials, and local loyalist militias. The civil war in the South is in a brutal stalemate, with increasingly cruel actions from both sides. The British hold a string of forts in an attempt to pacify the territory, while Patriot partisans control much of the backcountry. Greene makes his presence known almost immediately. In early April, they seize the first British position at Fort Watson, building a medieval-like tower to shoot over the walls. The fort and its 130 loyalist defenders are quickly captured. British command of the South has fallen to a 26-year-old Irishman, Lieutenant Colonel Lord Rawdon. And now, alerted to Greene's presence, he has no intention of waiting passively behind the safety of palisade walls. On the 25th of April, Rawdon leads 900 soldiers quietly through the woods and towards Greene's force of 1,500 unsuspecting men camped on Hobkirk's Hill. Greene's army, still cooking breakfast, soon scramble to form battle lines. As the British slowly move up the hill, Greene plans to use his numbers to envelop Rawdon and orders regiments to move against the British flanks, while William Washington's cavalry is sent to their rear. The initially confident British advance suddenly looks vulnerable, as canister shots rain down on them from artillery in the centre. The British line starts to falter, and victory is almost within reach for the Continentals. But in the attack, the 1st and 2nd Maryland regiments are suddenly shaken, as several of their commanding officers, including a colonel, are struck down. The Marylanders, pausing in disorder, are then charged by Rawdon's Volunteers of Ireland and put to flight. The tide of battle has turned in an instant, and Greene, lightly furious, is forced to withdraw from the field. Although a minor British victory, Rawdon is still in a difficult position, and he starts consolidating his forces. He abandons smaller outposts and then Camden itself. Although a tactically sound decision, it proves once again to local loyalists that the British cannot be relied upon to hold positions and protect their homes, and many start to desert. The Battle of Hobkirk's Hill has been a setback for Greene, but he is able to hang on to the strategic initiative. His forces are moving faster than the British expect, and partisan leaders, including Francis Marion and Thomas Sumter, strike with almost impunity against Forts Granby, Orangeburg, Mott, and Georgetown, all of which are captured in lightning assaults along with hundreds of British regulars and loyalists. By mid-May, Rawdon is left reeling by the speed of Greene's advance. Outside of Charlestown and Savannah, they have just two major forts left, at Augusta and 96. At Augusta, Andrew Pickens and Light Horse Harry Lee attack three loyalist fortifications garrisoned by some 600 men. After weeks of fighting and no hope of relief, one by one the forts start to capitulate. One of the garrisons and its hated loyalist commander are put to the sword and refused quarter. Such is the ferocity of the fighting in the south. At 96, Greene now attacks the most notorious British stronghold in South Carolina, a well-constructed, star-shaped fortress with a determined and mostly local garrison. As the siege progresses, word finally arrives of Rawdon's whereabouts. The British, after collecting reinforcements at Charlestown, were at last back on the march and on their way to relieve the fort. Greene decides to make a final assault before Rawdon's arrival. With hooks and ladders, his men storm the fort on the 18th of June. Sandbags and parapets are pulled down as the defences are slowly breached. The attack looks poised to succeed until men from New York and New Jersey counterattack. After a bloody struggle with bayonets, entrenchment tools, and muskets used as clubs, the attack is barely repelled. Greene abandons the siege shortly after, allowing Rawdon to evacuate the garrison to Charlestown. With the fort at 96 promptly burnt by the British, with it goes their last stronghold outside of the two coastal cities. The campaign so far has been a disaster for the British and Loyalist cause, who now mostly reside behind the safety of city walls. To keep supplies flowing into Charlestown and maintain a symbolic presence in the countryside, the British station their last mobile force at Eutaw Springs. In the early hours of September 8th, Greene's army of 2,400 men approached the British camp, 2,000 strong. Greene and the Continentals are confident and unusually on the offensive against the British field army. Their first line consists of militia, with Continentals behind them. They are soon at British Commander Colonel Stewart's line, and to Greene's delight, his militia fight well, even receiving British bayonet charges without retreating. In well-executed battlefield maneuvers, the militia eventually withdraws in good order, being replaced by Continental regulars at the front. The fighting is soon intense across the battlefield. The British are hard pressed and begin to break on their left. Soon the entire army is falling back, but it is not a rout, and a new line is formed, anchoring itself around a house occupied by loyalists barricaded inside. The situation is becoming dire for Stuart, and his men desperately cling on. Greene, to seal his victory, sends William Washington's cavalry to sweep through the British right flank and then into their rear. But protected by hedges, the British are able to repulse the dragoons, inflicting heavy losses, including Washington himself, who is promptly captured. In the centre, the British have withdrawn behind their camp. As the Continentals advance through the tents, the temptation to loot becomes too great, and men start to fall out of line to take what they can. As the Continental centre falls into disarray, Light Horse Harry Lee's legion attempts to storm the barricaded house at bayonet point. In bloody close-quarter fighting at doors and windows, the Loyalists inside fight for their lives. Continental cannons are soon brought up to turn the tide and batter the house. But the crews move too far forward and start to take heavy casualties from musket fire in the top windows. At this critical moment, the British have rallied on the flanks and now start to counterattack. With both armies exhausted and the Continental centre in chaos, the British charge is able to shift the balance in their favour. And just like at Hobkirk's Hill, victory is snatched away from the Continentals. Greene, to save his army, soon orders a general retreat. The battle is especially costly for the British, who take higher and irreplaceable losses. Without the strength to follow Greene, the countryside is finally and completely abandoned, and British forces are fully withdrawn to the safety of Savannah and Charlestown. For Greene, despite not winning a major engagement on the field, through his speed, organisation and persistence, he has successfully recaptured the majority of the Carolinas and Georgia in just a matter of months. All British hopes of holding significant amounts of territory in the south have been crushed. And critically, by September, Cornwallis now has no nearby friendly territory to move into from Yorktown. By 1781, the war for the British has become global. Well-executed American diplomacy, combined with the irresistible opportunity to settle old scores, has led the Dutch and Spanish to join the Franco-American cause, while many other European powers form a league of armed neutrality, isolating Britain both diplomatically and economically on the continent. In Europe, the British fend off threats directly against their own shores from Allied naval squadrons that mass off the coast, including an armada in 1779. After a French landing on the Channel Island of Jersey is repulsed, the threat of invasion feels all too real for many in London. Further south, the Spanish land 14,000 troops on British-held Minorca, while besieging Britain's most important possession in the Mediterranean, the fortress peninsula of Gibraltar. Known as the Rock, Gibraltar controls the entrance to the Mediterranean, giving Britain a vital naval base to protect trade routes, project power, and blockade French and Spanish fleets. At the height of the siege, 60,000 allies will attack 5,000 British defenders in the largest battle of the entire war. In India, the French support Sultan Hyder Ali in his campaign against the British East India Company. The Mysoreans, with French artillery and European-trained cavalry, launch lightning raids that devastate company outposts and begin to seriously threaten the nascent British presence on the subcontinent. A defeat here could hand France the upper hand in India, reshaping the future global balance of power. Dutch fleets too, while small, contest with the British across Southeast Asia, the Far East and Africa, in a war for trade posts and future influence. In the Caribbean and Britain's most important overseas holdings, by 1781, Dominica, St. Vincent, Grenada and Tobago have all fallen into Allied hands, while Jamaica, Britain's crown jewel in the region, is seriously threatened. For the British, these losses are already devastating financially, with over a third of the value of their global trade coming from the island's lucrative sugar exports. Any further losses, particularly Jamaica, could soon become catastrophic. In the Americas, Spanish forces have made serious progress in Florida. Governor Bernardo de Galvez gains a string of victories along the Gulf Coast, seizing Baton Rouge and Mobile, before besieging the capital, Pensacola, in March of 1781. Despite a spirited defense, particularly from Britain's Choctaw and Creek Indian allies, the final British defences surrender in May. With the capture of Pensacola, British power in the region collapses, and the Mississippian Gulf are secured for Spain. Across all of these theatres, Britain must devote tens of thousands of troops, numerous fleets, and huge quantities of resources to defend both Britain and their far-flung empire from America's new allies. Financial, political, and military pressure is mounting in this global war. And by 1781, Clinton and Cornwallis in North America can count on increasingly little in the way of reinforcements or vital naval support. Cornwallis and his army arrive in Virginia in May 1781, after marching overland from Wilmington. He hopes to take advantage of Greene moving south, while Washington is occupied in the north, and capture perhaps the biggest prize of the 13 colonies. Virginia is the wealthiest province, offering much-needed supplies and manpower the British now desperately need, along with a chance to break the deadlock by denying those same resources to the Continentals. British forces had arrived in Virginia at the start of the year, with Generals Phillips and the defector Benedict Arnold facing off against the Continental General, the Marquis de Lafayette. The British have taken or destroyed vast quantities of tobacco, freed slaves, and burnt property, in an effort to disrupt critical continental war supplies that flow out of the colony. Arnold has led much of the British efforts, including a raid against the capital, Richmond. In an infamous and vindictive move, Arnold and his loyalist forces burn much of the city, targeting government buildings and private homes of their enemies. A large bounty is promptly placed on Arnold's head for his capture. Cornwallis wastes little time and continues the successful raiding as his army swells to over 7,000 men. Tarleton is let loose on the countryside, and thousands of muskets, barrels of gunpowder, clothing, and all means of military provisions are captured or destroyed. Even the governor of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson, narrowly escapes capture in an early morning attack on Charlottesville. But other members of the Virginia General Assembly aren't so lucky. Lafayette, with just under 5,000 men, expertly shadows the British, being under orders to evade Cornwallis and protect what military stores they can. Cornwallis's campaign is going well, and he has the initiative, despite not yet fully engaging the elusive Lafayette. With his current momentum, Cornwallis is starting to seriously threaten the Continental War effort. He is adamant that the Allies must soon respond, and hopes that there will be a decisive battle in Virginia to decide the war. He writes to Clinton suggesting they join forces in the colony, but the strategic disagreements and miscommunication between the two generals is persisting. Cornwallis's decision to leave the Carolinas for Virginia had been against Clinton's orders, souring relations to an all-time low. And now Clinton is anticipating Washington will assault New York, where he has no intention of abandoning the city. To Cornwallis's dismay, in June he receives stern orders from Clinton to send most of his army north to aid in New York's defenses. Cornwallis's hopes for a decisive campaign in Virginia are dashed, and he begins to wind down operations. As the majority of his men prepare to leave, Cornwallis receives fresh orders in late June to instead support a joint offensive against Philadelphia. Cornwallis disagrees and writes to Clinton angrily over the plans, but begins to embark his troops nonetheless. Just as transport ships are set to leave Portsmouth, Cornwallis receives yet a new letter and yet new orders. A naval base is now to be established on the Chesapeake Bay, to be used as a springboard for undecided future operations. He is told to stop campaigning, dig in somewhere defensible, and await further instructions. Perhaps in this moment, Cornwallis finds himself adrift. Outfoxed by Greene in the Carolinas, hampered by Clinton's contradictory orders in Virginia, and fighting a war that increasingly feels uncertain or even futile. Instead of expanding British control in Virginia and seeking battle as he planned, Cornwallis now moves as commanded and entrenches his army on a lonely peninsula at Yorktown. In March 1781, a large French fleet under the Count de Grasse leaves Brest and begins to sail west. The fleet's departure goes abnormally unchallenged, with the Royal Navy occupied with resupplying the besieged garrison at Gibraltar and other pressing commitments. Admiral de Grasse moves with a significant fleet, fresh troops, and enough hard currency to fund the entire Continental Army for a full year. Such a force arriving in North America would mean that for the first time, the British fleet is outnumbered in the theatre. The French government had been growing weary of the increasingly costly war, but they had been begrudgingly convinced to send further support by the American ambassador in Paris, Benjamin Franklin. At White Plains, Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, George Washington, is elated with the news of the French fleet's departure. His army is in a poor state, and he faces increasingly critical supply and financial challenges made worse by the war spreading to Virginia. The threat of further mutinies, like in the previous year, hangs heavy on his shoulders. Washington quickly calls for a conference with the commander of French forces in Newport, Lieutenant General Count de Rochambeau. The two men meet at Wethersfield in Connecticut and agree to finally join their forces, creating a Franco-American army of some 10,000 men. Washington is adamant that the Allies should strike against New York and the center of British operations in North America. Here he believes they can deal a final death blow to Britain's dominion in America. Rochambeau, although as polite as ever, has different ideas. He is skeptical of what could be a long and difficult siege against a well-defended New York. Rochambeau also recognizes that French support is waning, and he therefore wants to make the most of de Grasse's fleet, which may not return, and any temporary naval superiority they can gain. At the conference, Rochambeau instead proposes an attack against the more vulnerable British forces in Virginia. Washington, as Commander-in-Chief of Allied forces, has the final say, and the meeting ends with an agreement to focus on New York, while keeping the door open on an attack further south. As Washington begins to make plans for the Allied assault in New York, Rochambeau drafts a fateful letter. He secretly writes to Admiral de Grasse, making clear his preference for the upcoming campaign. For weeks, the two generals carefully observe British defences in New York, marshal their resources, and search for weaknesses. A letter finally arrives in July, bringing news from de Grasse. To Washington's, but perhaps not Rochambeau's surprise, the French fleet will arrive at the Chesapeake Bay off the Virginia coast in August, and not New York. De Grasse writes that he will only be able to stay for 2 months, giving the Allies a narrow window of opportunity for combined operations. With the news, the die has been cast on Washington's behalf. The general puts any personal frustrations with his French allies behind him, and forever the pragmatist immediately gives up on his plans for New York. Starting in earnest, Washington now begins to prepare for a campaign against Cornwallis in Yorktown. In New York, General Clinton, as Commander-in-Chief of British forces, has been struggling to create a new, unified strategy for the war. Communication with his second-in-command, Cornwallis, continues to be fraught with tension over perceived and real slights between the two men. Throughout the summer, Clinton has been intercepting letters and gathering intelligence on Washington's plans for an assault on New York. Although the situation and threat level is continuously changing, decisive action is desperately needed if the British are to regain the initiative. Clinton's orders, however, become increasingly frantic and contradictory, and often arrive late and in a mixed sequence, further confusing his officers. At one stage in June, Clinton, in an attempt to develop some semblance of an offensive strategy, considers striking against Philadelphia and the vast continental supplies around the city. But he is also barely on speaking terms with the commander of the British fleet, Vice Admiral Arbuthnot, who firstly seeks a naval base in the Chesapeake Bay to support operations. The plans for Philadelphia are soon dropped as quickly as they were conceived. Communication between the British leadership, let alone combined operations, is starting to become extremely difficult. And the infighting and bickering come at the most critical moment of the war, where British commanders could not afford to act alone, but were equally refusing to act together. In a tentative olive branch to the Navy, and in the absence of a wider strategy, Clinton finally sends the fateful orders to Cornwallis to establish a naval base at the entrance to the Chesapeake Bay, while he continues to prepare, with the bulk of the army, for the now abandoned Allied assault on New York. Washington, meanwhile, does all he can to convince Clinton that New York continues to be the target. He positions forces around the city, establishing camps, ovens, and artillery batteries as if in preparation for a long siege, while also allowing fake plans to fall into British hands. All the while, the majority of the Franco-American army start the 4-week-long march to Virginia in secret. The British completely fall for the ruse, and neither Clinton or Cornwallis have any idea of the Allied movements. French Admiral de Grasse, true to his word, arrives at the Chesapeake Bay in late August. The Allied plan to strike against Cornwallis at Yorktown is bold, and it still carries a potential fatal flaw. The British fleet is still very much intact and of a similar size to that of the French. Its whereabouts is unknown to the Allies, and without full control of the sea, Cornwallis can still be rescued or reinforced. As de Grasse disembarks troops and supplies, on the 5th of September, enemy sails are ominously spotted on the horizon. All roads are now converging on Yorktown, and the scene is slowly being set for the most decisive encounter of the American Revolutionary War. In October 1781, Continental soldiers peer out of their growing entrenchments at Yorktown, at the apocalyptic siege in front of them. Many of the men have been fighting for 6 long, punishing years. Some had joined the hopeful cause at Concord and Bunker Hill. Endured and suffered terribly in Quebec and Valley Forge. They had held on to hope through New York and defeats at Brandywine, Charleston and Camden. But the men also knew glory and triumphs at Saratoga, Kings Mountain, Cowpens, and an unknown number of unrecorded battles across the continent. And after it all, they were now here, at the edge of something extraordinary, watching artillery batteries bombard their mortal enemy. Whether the men knew it or not, the fate of the American Revolution is about to be decided. Months earlier, in May of 1781, General George Washington, Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, prepares for a conference with his French allies at Wethersfield, Connecticut. At this stage in the war, both sides are utterly exhausted, on the brink, and searching for ways to end the conflict. For the Continentals, their new friends from across the sea may well tilt the balance in their favour. After all, Washington is, as for most of the war, in a dangerous predicament. He can rely on just a few thousand men fit for duty in his army, a sorry number that reflects low morale and the failures of both Congress and the individual states. The country's finances are in a dire position. Congress has long funded the war by printing paper money unbacked by hard currency, gold or silver coins, and since 1780, the dollar has become virtually worthless, with Congress itself effectively bankrupt. To pick up the slack, responsibility for funding and supplying the army now falls to the states, many of which are unwilling to raise the necessary taxes to meet their obligations. Between a hamstrung Congress and reluctant states, the Continental Army is left unpaid, undersupplied, and dangerously close to collapse. Worse still, his French allies know it. The commander of French land forces in North America, Lieutenant General Count de Rochambeau, sees the collapse of the American war effort as a distinct possibility, and has orders to sail his 5,000 men, currently stationed in Rhode Island, to the Caribbean should the Continental Army fall apart. But as bad as things are for the Continentals, their British rivals are faring no better. The entry of France, Spain, and the Dutch Republic had transformed the conflict into a world war, stretching the British Army and Navy globally, fighting wars from India to Gibraltar, the Caribbean, and across the length of North America. In London, with no decisive victory in sight after 6 years, the war is growing deeply unpopular, with many politicians and members of the public alike sympathising with the American cause. Meanwhile, mounting costs are driving public debt to record levels, fueling political division while eroding any remaining confidence in Lord North's government. On the battlefield, the 1780-81 Southern Campaign saw setback after setback for the British, culminating in the bloody fighting at Guilford Court House in North Carolina, where General Charles Cornwallis had simultaneously won a victory and ruined his field army. To the deep frustration of his commanding officer in New York, General Sir Henry Clinton, Cornwallis then moves to Virginia in May 1781, abandoning his southern garrisons. Continental General Nathanael Greene, bruised but undefeated, promptly moves to take advantage and marches south. Like British General Burgoyne before him at Saratoga, Cornwallis had judged any move backwards to be disgraceful. But by marching proudly into Virginia, he leaves the South to unravel behind him. A short and disastrous summer for British-held South Carolina and Georgia soon follows, with all except for the cities of Charleston, Savannah, and a few minor holdouts captured by the Continentals. Cornwallis has become increasingly erratic and fanatical in his determination to bring the Continentals to a climactic battle to decide the war. Despite this strategy failing in North Carolina, he is convinced that Virginia is where the Americans can be brought to a final showdown. He even goes as far as to call for all British forces to be brought to Virginia, abandoning cities like New York. To many observers, these are not the actions of a man attempting to further the interests of the crown, but rather those of a punch-drunk brawler looking for one last chance at glory. Clinton does little to rein him in, partly because Cornwallis enjoys considerable political support in London, where ministers, in their desperation to end the war, increasingly listen to Cornwallis's promises of glory. Clinton's strategy, on the other hand, unpopular but perhaps the most prudent, is for the British to maintain their strongholds, strike out in devastating raids along the coast, and wait for the financially crippling war to bring the United States and France to the negotiating table. But that strategy will take time, perhaps years, and cannot work unless commanders like Cornwallis follow their orders. Throughout early 1781, the British hold the initiative in Virginia. They raid deep into the colony, destroying huge quantities of stores and scattering militia, while the Continentals cautiously trail behind. On Cornwallis's arrival, he plans for an offensive that could now seriously threaten the Continental war efforts. Virginia is the wealthiest province, providing the Continental Army with vast amounts of supplies and manpower. And the war arriving in the state is a serious threat to Washington at the worst possible moment. Clinton's attention, however, remains fixated on New York. Convinced that Washington and the French may soon strike the city, he has no intention of weakening its defenses by committing large forces to Virginia. Yet for Clinton's strategy to work, he still needs to operate along the Chesapeake. The Royal Navy, too, is pressing for a secure harbour in the bay, from which ships could raid the coast, disrupt American supply lines, and support future operations inland. In Virginia, warships can move vital troops, guns, and provisions deep into the colony, meaning that control of the land depends heavily on control of the sea. Clinton's solution is a compromise. Cornwallis is ordered to abandon his inland campaign and instead establish a fortified naval base somewhere along the Chesapeake. For Cornwallis, who had hoped to force a decisive battle, the order is a bitter pill to swallow. He marches his army to the small tobacco port of Yorktown, arriving in early August, where his men begin slowly entrenching themselves on a narrow peninsula along the York River. For the Marquis de Lafayette, commanding the outnumbered Continental forces in Virginia, he has been holding his own against firstly the turncoat Benedict Arnold and later the seasoned commander Major General William Phillips. The very same Phillips who had killed Lafayette's father in Prussia 21 years earlier at the Battle of Minden. Lafayette has been following Greene's example set during the race to the Dan months earlier, and instead of seeking vengeance against Phillips, following a Fabian strategy of avoiding battle and waiting for favourable circumstances. This was fast becoming a winning strategy for the Continentals that, like for the Romans centuries earlier, had been learnt at a great cost. What Lafayette and any other Continental commander could never have imagined, however, was just how favourable their circumstances would soon become. A few years earlier in 1778, when France formally entered the war, the Royal Navy was still the largest and most experienced in the world, with roughly 100 ships of the line in service. Ships of the line are the battleships of the era, massive wooden warships carrying 50 to over 100 heavy cannon, designed to fight in a formal line of battle, where fleets sail in parallel and fire at one another with devastating broadsides. The French Navy, however, has been rebuilt following a series of defeats during the 7 Years' War, and can now field up to 80 capital ships of their own. With these modern and well-designed ships, France, along with Spanish and Dutch fleets, can now more than challenge Britain for control of key theatres from the English Channel to the American coastline. Since France entered the war, Washington has hoped above all that naval superiority could now be achieved, breaking Britain's chief military advantage. But 2.5 years had gone by with little progress made against the Royal Navy. The French had botched a number of opportunities to engage the British fleet, including at Philadelphia, New York, and Rhode Island. Furthermore, their only major military action in the theatre so far, an amphibious assault against Savannah in 1779, had been an unmitigating disaster. Since then, what remained of the French fleet in North America has been dormant at Newport. Throughout this time, Great Britain has been fighting a global war against the Allies, meaning that less than 1/10 of the British fleet can be allocated to North America. Protection of the homeland is paramount. Naval superiority in Europe has to be maintained to ward off the threat of an Allied invasion of England. In a careful balancing act, squadrons can only be detached to North America in pursuit of Allied shipping, which is precisely what happens in March 1781, when a large French fleet under the Count de Grasse leaves Brest and begins to sail west. Back at Wethersfield in May, although the French fleet's destination is unknown to Washington, the news of its departure is electrifying. and planning begins between the Continental and French commanders. What is known is that de Grasse sails with thousands of reinforcements and enough hard currency to fund the Continental Army for a full year. Washington and the French commander, Count de Rochambeau, have competing ideas for how they could best use the arrival of de Grasse. Washington plans for an attack against New York, and the center of British operations in North America. Rochambeau, however, concerned that New York is too well defended, looks south to attack General Phillips and Arnold, who are potentially vulnerable and reliant on naval support around the Chesapeake Bay. The two commanders agreed to concentrate on New York while leaving the door open for an attack further south. Rochambeau, however, a polite yet cunning officer, secretly writes to de Grasse, instead urging him not to sail to New York, but to the Chesapeake Bay. Washington, like many of his officers, is foremost a farmer and a soldier, and often at odds with his aristocratic and sometimes scheming French counterparts. Over the summer, while planning for an assault against New York, they hear reports that Cornwallis has moved to Virginia. A letter then finally arrives in July, bringing news from de Grasse. Washington is caught off guard. To his, but not Rochambeau's surprise, the French fleet will arrive at the Chesapeake Bay at the end of August. De Grasse writes that he will only be able to stay until mid-October, giving the Allies a narrow window of opportunity for combined operations. Although frustrating news for Washington, he soon also learns that Cornwallis is entrenching himself at Yorktown, making the shift in strategy far more enticing. As he has shown throughout the war, Washington is as much a pragmatist as he is a gambler. And now, with his hands tied and the future of the United States on the line, he decides to roll the dice. And the Allies set their sights on Yorktown. But the challenges ahead are enormous. Success depends on a series of events aligning across half a continent and an ocean, all within a matter of weeks. Two French fleets must converge on the Chesapeake, one sailing from the Caribbean under de Grasse, the other departing Newport under Admiral de Barras, carrying the heavy siege guns needed to break the British fortifications. Both squadrons must evade the Royal Navy, navigate uncertain winds and summer storms, and arrive precisely at the right moment. At the same time, nearly 10,000 American and French soldiers must march hundreds of miles south, along poor roads in oppressive summer heat, while somehow convincing the British commander, General Clinton, that the real target remains New York. And finally, assuming that the British oblige the Allies and stay in Yorktown, in a short space of time they must subdue Cornwallis. If the deception fails, Clinton and Cornwallis could well strike out in a pincer movement. If the fleets are delayed, the army could well arrive alone. And if the Royal Navy appears first, Cornwallis could flee. A flurry of orders are quickly dispatched by Washington. Lafayette is to do all he can to keep Cornwallis bottled up at Yorktown, while a small continental force is to remain in New York, establishing camps, ovens, and artillery batteries as if in preparation for a long siege. All the while, the majority of the Franco-American army is to start the 4-week-long march to Virginia in secret. Across land and sea, armies and fleets begin moving towards Virginia. Separated by hundreds of miles, unable to communicate, and racing against time. By all accounts, Washington needs a miracle. In Clinton's camp, reports have been slowly filtering in from loyalists in the countryside, and by early September, the stark reality of the Allied move south is starting to emerge. Clinton, after writing to Cornwallis to warn him and promise support, quickly turns to the Royal Navy. The recently combined fleet in New York, under Admiral Thomas Graves, soon leaves port with 19 capital ships and 1,400 guns, on a mission to find and stop the French. De Grasse arrives at the Chesapeake at the end of August. When the white sails are first spotted by British sentries, it sends serious alarm through their camp. But Cornwallis's overconfidence in his strength and the promises from Clinton of support lead him to ignore the growing pleas from his senior officers to abandon Yorktown and move south. A day after arriving, the French fleet of 22 ships of the line and 1,500 guns begins to land troops ashore, and with that, the balance of power shifts against the British. But fortunately for Cornwallis, he didn't need to question for long when Clinton's promised support would arrive. On the morning of the 5th of September, the British fleet appears. Admiral Graves, sailing west towards the Chesapeake, is not expecting a major French fleet, following reports of De Grasse in Havana. But the growing number of sails he can see 10 miles away soon proves the intelligence wrong, as De Grasse and his ships race towards them. Not wanting to waste time, De Grasse has set sail as soon as the British are spotted, leaving hundreds of sailors behind. The French must, at all costs, maintain control of the bay if they are to trap Cornwallis in Yorktown. With the wind blowing from the northeast, the British hold the weather gauge. The weather gauge is an important advantage in naval warfare. The direction a ship can sail is governed by the wind, and a ship cannot maneuver directly against it. A ship upwind can therefore control the distance and engage when it chooses. But this comes with two distinct disadvantages. Firstly, when turning to engage, the attacking ship is exposed to raking fire, where only their bow guns can be brought to bear. Secondly, as the wind blows both ships at the same angle, the ship with the weather gauge may find its lower gun deck below the waterline, reducing its firepower and angle of shot. As the two fleets draw near, they find themselves moving in opposite directions. To avoid the shoals, Graves takes the decision to turn his fleet in unison and reverse the line. This is a safer turn for keeping a fleet in formation, but it crucially now moves his best ships from the front to the rear of the line. The fleets continue to steadily close, but with the rapid French deployment from the bay, a 3-mile gap has appeared between their lead ships and the rest of the squadron. The opening is wide enough for Graves to use his weather gauge advantage and attempt to break the French line. A common tactic of the era, isolating a number of ships which could then be overwhelmed while forcing the surviving ships to flee. But Graves, stubbornly wanting his own ships in order before attacking, does not seize the opportunity, to the horror of his captains. Instead, the lines continue to slowly converge towards the front until the engagement truly begins. The French ships, downwind, have the firing advantage and open up devastating broadsides against the British van. Graves, in an attempt to bring his entire line parallel to the French, now makes yet another mistake. He signals his fleet to close the distance and attack, but he flies two signals. One to turn more directly and close for action as he intends, and one to form a line ahead where ships close at a much slower pace. Unfortunately for Graves, naval signal books prioritize forming a line first, and his rear and best ships do not turn to attack. At 4 o'clock, with the light beginning to fade, the British van and centre start to finally press the attack. But closing the distance takes time, and the angle of approach has allowed the French to inflict significant damage with raking fire, eventually causing the two lead British ships to fall out of formation in disarray. At the front, ships are soon close enough for musket and pistol fire, and several captains consider boarding actions. Waves of smoke clouds make it difficult to tell friend from foe, a problem compounded by ever-shifting wind that moves ships unexpectedly. In the melee, the 80-gun French ship, Auguste, soon draws up beside HMS Princessa, unleashing punishing broadsides until the British ship is forced to pull back to avoid capture. The Auguste next turns its attention to HMS Terrible, which it soon hammers into a floating wreck. Meanwhile, the beleaguered French ship, Diadem, has most of her guns knocked out under relentless fire from HMS Albion, until the Albion herself is forced to escape from French reinforcements. After an hour and a half of these dueling engagements, men on both sides are exhausted and the vans start to slowly separate. Although sporadic fire continues from the centre, with the light fading, the day's battle is effectively over. Both fleets stand off in sight of each other the next day, making repairs and considering their options. Graves holds a council of war and is encouraged to outmaneuver de Grasse and sail directly for the Chesapeake. But Graves, concerned about his heavily damaged fleet, ultimately decides to sail back to New York for repairs. And with that fatal decision, Cornwallis is now truly alone. On the 10th of September, the Second French Fleet under Admiral de Barras enters the Chesapeake Bay, arriving unscathed from British patrols and carrying the heavy cannon needed for a siege. Until the arrival of the French, Cornwallis had been leisurely fortifying his position, without real concern for Lafayette's force in front of him. But with the French landings and the defeat of the Royal Navy, in just a matter of days, Cornwallis's position has moved from stable to dangerously exposed. In this moment, Cornwallis is fully aware that Washington is on the way with a large army, and he must understand that Clinton would struggle to support him following Graves's defeat. For now at least, opposing him is a force similar in size to his own. Some 5,000 Continentals and militia, supported by the 3,000 French reinforcements from de Grasse's fleet. At his war council, the aggressive Colonel Bannister Tarleton advocates for action and for a battle that Cornwallis himself has long sought. But at this critical moment, Cornwallis hesitates. If they break out past Lafayette, they would be forced to abandon their supplies and guns, march hundreds of miles through enemy territory, all the while being harassed by French cavalry and American militia. It would be a huge risk. But equally, he knows that staying is incredibly dangerous. Faced with the dilemma of his career, Cornwallis surprises his officers, and instead of seeking battle, he decides to place his faith in a miracle rescue from Clinton, and he holds his post at Yorktown. Unfortunately for the British troops frantically digging trenches, further north in New York, Clinton is dithering. reports suggest Yorktown can hold out until the end of October, giving Clinton 6 weeks to organize relief efforts. He considers landing an army in Virginia, but without complete control of the sea, he is concerned they too will become trapped. Instead, Clinton stalls for time and concentrates on repairing Graves' fleet in New York Harbor. In Washington's camp, still 2 weeks away from Yorktown, the mood is rapidly changing from anxious uncertainty to quiet excitement. Washington meets with de Grasse, where they agree that the French army and fleet will extend their stay until the end of October, but not a day longer. This gives Washington, after he arrives at Yorktown, perhaps just a month to defeat Cornwallis. Whether that was enough time was anyone's guess. After a difficult and exhausting march in the heat, finally, on the 28th of September, Washington's army marches into view of Yorktown. The siege has begun. Cornwallis had chosen to fortify Yorktown a month earlier because its deep harbour could allow Royal Navy ships to anchor close to shore, while the town itself, of some 70 houses, sits on high bluffs and a defensible peninsula. The British defences are strong, with all approaches cleared of vegetation, leaving only tree stumps to hinder enemy movement. The main town is surrounded by an inner line of connecting redoubts, earthworks, and batteries. The outer works consist of a series of well-constructed fortifications, including the Fusiliers Redoubt and what the Allies would soon dub Redoubts 9 and 10, all with the task of slowing the enemy's advance. To the north, across the York River, sits the equally well-defended town of Gloucester. The British maintain local naval superiority, giving them unopposed movement between the towns. To the chagrin of Washington, de Grasse refuses to put his fleet in further danger by entering the York River and severing the British positions. All in all, Cornwallis's defences are well manned by 8,000 British, German, and American troops, and some 65 cannons. They also have 3,000 to 4,000 escaped slaves who had fled to British lines earlier in the campaign and were now desperately digging trenches in the hopes of maintaining their freedom. Across the field in the Allied camps, commanders are feeling triumphant, and rightfully so. Against all the odds, they had pulled off the impossible, and now surrounded Yorktown with 40,000 men, the largest concentration of people in all of North America. In all, 8,000 Continentals, 3,000 militia, and 28,000 French soldiers and sailors. Crucially, and thanks to Admiral de Barras, they can also field at least 70 guns, most of them heavy cannon, that far outmatch anything in the British arsenal. Washington's first move is to seal off the British outpost at Gloucester and prevent any chance of an escape north. Reinforcements are dispatched, and the first fighting of the siege takes place. Tarleton has been leading foraging parties beyond the British lines, regularly seizing food and fodder at will. But newly arrived French hussars plan for a confrontation. And in the early morning, the two cavalry forces meet. Tarleton and the French commander, the Duke of Lauzun, charge one another, intent on a duel. But before they meet, a collision unhorses Tarleton, who only avoids capture thanks to the quick action of his loyalist troops, who surround and protect their captain. The skirmish, although indecisive, has the intended effect, and it puts a firm stop to any further foraging parties, or realistic prospects of a British escape north. With only 1 month before the French leave and effectively end the siege, Washington must act quickly. But the defences are too strong to be assaulted immediately, and he does not have the time to starve Cornwallis into submission. He must therefore begin a formal siege. Here the French bring their expertise, and a series of concentric and interconnected trenches, known as parallels, start to be dug. The first parallel is to sit roughly 600 yards from British lines and must be dug at night to avoid cannon fire. Large openings are placed at intervals for artillery pieces, which hold their fire during construction to avoid detection and concentrated British fire. Zigzag trenches can then be dug in pathways towards British lines, where the next parallel is created. The process is repeated until close enough for an infantry assault, if necessary. Before the Allies can focus on the main defences, the British outer works must be taken. But here, Cornwallis does the completely unexpected. On the morning of the 30th of September, the Allies wake to discover, to their shock, that the British have abandoned much of their outer works, except for the Fusiliers redoubt to the west and redoubts 9 and 10 to the east. Instead of fighting for every inch to slow the siege, Cornwallis, in a bid to consolidate his lines, has abandoned a significant roadblock for the Allies and sped up the timetable for the bombardment of his main fortifications. By October 10th, the first Allied parallel is complete, furnished with 41 cannons, mortars, and howitzers. At the Grand Battery, containing some of the Allies' largest guns, Washington is given the distinction of firing the first shot of the newly finished works. Over the next 24 hours alone, well over 3,000 more would follow. For the British, a new phase of the siege has begun, and each passing day would bring a more intense bombardment than the last. Cannonballs begin ricocheting through the town, while bombshells, huge iron balls filled with gunpowder, are fired from mortars in high arcs into the defences. Soldiers and civilians seek refuge where they can, with many sheltering at a beach behind the town, while British gun crews can barely return fire of their own. By the morning of the 12th, the British wake to more bad news. In the night, the Allies had completed a second parallel, this one just 300 yards from the main defensive line. Thanks to Redoubt 9 and 10, it was at least somewhat contained and could not extend to the river. For Washington and Rochambeau, these forts must now be taken, and for the troops, eager to do something other than dig, there was finally a chance to get at the enemy. Redoubt 10, garrisoned by 70 men, is to be attacked by American light infantry under Alexander Hamilton, while Redoubt 9, with its 120 defenders, is to be attacked by French grenadiers and chasseurs. Both will advance with 400 men each. Diversionary movements and attacks are made across the line before the assault begins. putting the British on high alert to other parts of the defences. And with the designated signal, 6 shots fired in rapid succession at 8 PM, the Allies move silently forward. Their muskets are unloaded to stop any premature firing that gives the element of surprise away, meaning that bayonets, pikes, and all means of close-quarter weapons will be primarily used. The Americans arrive first. They have been ordered to wait for sappers to clear a pathway through the sharp branches in the outer perimeter. But, keen for action, the men push through in the dark and make for the parapets. A British sentry soon raises the alarm, and musket balls and grenades start to rain down on the attackers. Hamilton, climbing on the shoulders of his men, is one of the first into the redoubt, and a confused and desperate melee begins. But, heavily outnumbered, British resistance first wanes, and then collapses. Within minutes, the entire garrison has fled or surrendered. The French, advancing in columns, unlike the Americans, pause dutifully for their sappers to clear a way through the branches. But as the sappers get to work, signal rockets begin to light up the sky, and the German defenders take aim. The next few minutes are devastating for the attackers. Huddled together, they are sitting ducks. Just as pathways mercifully begin to appear, the Germans, now organised, charge down to meet them. But the Germans, although brave, are hopelessly outnumbered and quickly captured. The French soon start pouring over the walls, and like at Redoubt 10, within minutes, the action is over. Back in New York, Clinton has prepared 6,000 men to join the fleet, now 25 ships strong, in a rescue attempt. With a good wind, they could arrive in 5 days, and Admiral Graves had agreed to be ready by the 5th of October. But Graves is privately skeptical about their chances and postpones with various excuses until the middle of the month. Finally, after much delay, to Clinton's growing frustration, on the 19th of October, the Fleet and Relief Army set sail from New York. Three days prior in Yorktown, Cornwallis has so far conducted a passive defence with no serious counterattacks. But the loss of his redoubts, which are quickly being incorporated into the Allies' second parallel, has finally shocked the general into action. At dawn on the 16th, 400 British light infantry and guards move slowly out of their trenches. The British attack where the French and American lines meet, and find initial success, spiking guns and capturing or killing sleeping Allied troops. But the men are quickly driven back, and the raid is too little too late to change the dire situation. That same day, the British are relentlessly shelled, and with the rescue fleet from New York nowhere in sight, there was now only one thing left to try. Cornwallis must attempt an escape. Taking up Tarleton's pleas for an evacuation north, he decides to move any man fit to march to Gloucester, before punching through the 2,000-strong American lines and racing to New York on foot. The proposal is daring and, with their control of the waterways still secure thanks to the inaction of de Grasse, still remotely possible. Tarleton quietly prepares horses and wagons for the march, and at sundown, boats start to ferry the British Army across the York River. Cornwallis writes a letter to Washington, imploring him to look after the sick troops that will be left behind, and he heads to the boats. At midnight, as the second wave embarks for the journey, the weather, as if by providence, suddenly moves from calm to storm. Where the seas had been stable for weeks, boats were now capsizing and being forced uncontrollably downriver. Along the beaches, already filled with the desperate and dying, men watched the calamity in horror. One American loyalist watching on writes that the unfolding tragedy is an evil omen brought onto the army, and who could blame him? By morning, the breakout is cancelled, and soldiers that had made it to Gloucester wearily row back, defeated and under torrential fire from Allied guns. The bombardment soon resumes, as Allied gun crews now compete against one another to destroy the defences. British guns answer when they can, but they are outmatched, outgunned, and increasingly out of ammunition. For the soldiers hiding in ditches, cellars, and earthworks, there is no rest or respite, only the constant whistling of incoming fire and the sickening pause before it lands. In the growing horror, Cornwallis has seen enough and calls for a council of war. With the sick and wounded increasing by the hour and their own headquarters struck by enemy fire, his senior officers are asked whether they should fight to the last man or surrender. The room deliberates, and the decision is unanimous. At 10 o'clock on the cold morning of October 17th, 1781, a drummer boy climbs the British entrenchments and beats a parley. An officer stands next to him, waving a white handkerchief. Coming down to the Allied lines, the British officer is blindfolded and escorted to the rear with a letter in hand from Cornwallis. The letter reads, "Sir, I propose a cessation of hostilities for 24 hours, and that 2 officers may be appointed by each side to meet at Mr. Moore's house, to settle terms for the surrender of the posts at York and Gloucester." The next morning at sunrise, the solemn sound of bagpipes replaces the thunder of cannon fire. Men on both sides slowly climb up and sit on their defensive works to take in the scene and all that it means. The siege is over, and with it, the last great battle of the war. Across land and sea, fleets had arrived, armies converged, and deceptions had held. And in the final hours, even the weather had joined the Allied cause, denying a British escape. For the first time in Washington's military career, everything had gone to plan. He had stood in Wethersfield just months earlier, caught between the bankruptcy of his own government and the quiet judgment of his French allies. Now, his gamble and years of struggle had paid off. Washington had led an entire army across a continent, and in doing so, he had become the architect of a new world order. The terms of the unconditional surrender are as Cornwallis could have expected. except for one detail. To his dismay, the British will receive the same honours of war granted to the surrendering Continental garrison under General Lincoln at Charleston a year earlier. And so on the 19th of October, the British Army marches out of Yorktown. In a slow, sombre step, their flags are not flown and a popular tune is played. The world turned upside down. As the defeated men march to ground their arms in a field. They are flanked on either side by the victorious Allies. On the one side stood the French, a shimmering wall of professional soldiers, well turned out in their clean, white uniforms. On the other side stood the Continentals, many barefoot and in war-torn clothing. Yet in the eyes of the French, some of whom had considered the revolution a lost cause only months earlier, the Continentals had earned their respect and stood as equals. Cornwallis had signed the documents, but he could not face the humiliation of being present at the surrender, and he feigns illness. The Irish General O'Hara takes his place and offers his sword to Washington, who, with quiet satisfaction, defers him to General Lincoln. That evening, Washington holds a dinner for the officers of the three armies, and O'Hara again leads the British contingent. Only Banastre Tarleton is left uninvited, his reputation preceding him. A week after the surrender, the British relief fleet under Admiral Graves finally arrives at the Chesapeake to find the battle decided. The outcome was as much down to Allied planning as it was to poor British generalship. Cornwallis had, at the very moments he needed to lead, deferred decision-making to Clinton and passively lingered in an exposed defensive position. Graves had blundered through the campaign and dragged his feet in supporting rescue efforts, while Clinton had misread the situation and failed to impose any authority or clear strategic direction. And what followed in London was not reflection, but recrimination, a years-long blame game between commanders over who had lost America. As for the thousands of slaves who had trusted the British only to be often horrifically mistreated, Cornwallis makes no effort to protect them, and after the surrender, most are returned to their masters or claimed by Allied troops. Captured Americans serving in the British Army are mostly freed, except for the Continental deserters who had switched sides. They are promptly hanged. The Yorktown campaign is a reflection of the leadership of both sides for the entire war. For the British, Yorktown is the natural end for a conflict mismanaged from the very beginning. Characterized by a rigid, often arrogant command that consistently underestimated its opponent, lacked a unified strategy, and often fractured into petty infighting. Commanders routinely operated in siloed worlds, mistaking passive defense and bureaucratic finger-pointing for generalship. Conversely, the Allied victory mirrors the very essence of the American war effort, a triumph of sheer grit over traditional power. Washington and his generals had been resourceful, adaptable, and willing to risk loss for a final victory. While the French had gambled vast amounts of money and resources to keep an underdog rebellion alive, and then finally, when it mattered most, provided the naval miracle that Washington had long sought. the fallout for the defeat is immediate. When news reaches London, Lord North cries out, "Oh God, it's all over." Debate rages in Parliament over what to do next, and the King even drafts his own abdication. Within months, Lord North is forced to resign by the opposition party, who have grown desperate to open negotiations and end the war. Yorktown is catastrophic for the British military situation. British General Guy Carleton is sent to replace Clinton, who, along with Cornwallis, arrives in London surrounded by rumours and controversy. Carleton barely has enough troops to protect New York, and his offensive options are non-existent. The British are, however, able to defeat and capture de Grasse the following year at the Naval Battle of the Saints, removing much of the French military support to the Americans. Without the French Navy, the stalemate mostly resumes, preventing Washington attempting a similar siege of Charleston or New York. The new British government is willing to accept American independence in return for peace, and negotiations begin in Paris. Charleston and Savannah are abandoned, and a preliminary peace signed in November 1782. But because Britain must also negotiate with France, Spain, and the Dutch, final peace does not come until September 1783. The terms are sweeping. Britain recognises independence, with new borders being drawn around Canada, Britain's last possession on the continent. Spain recovers Florida, while France, whose navy and finances had made victory possible, take only modest gains in the Caribbean. After the war ends, 100,000 loyalists will leave the new country, representing close to 5% of the pre-war population. The start of the British Empire's recovery in Asia will be in large part supported by these American loyalists, who advocate expansion and help rebuild the empire in a new, more liberal image. For the now free United States, the cost of the war has been immense. For 8 years, armies had marched across the continent, leaving destruction in their wake. Disease and hardship had claimed far more lives than battles, and although victorious, the United States has emerged fragile, indebted, and uncertain of its future. But for the first time in history, a new nation has been founded on the idea that power should rest not with a king, but with the people. A government built on their consent and in opposition to much of the old world and their aristocratic rule. In a pattern seen throughout history, a determined insurgency had taken on the greatest military power of the era. The United States had endured, outlasted, and prevailed. For all their struggles, the promises of the new republic are unmistakable, and it quickly begins to draw in those seeking land, opportunity, and a new beginning. The fighting in America is over, and soon starts the mammoth yet electrifying task of building a new nation and government system. But along the frontiers of North America, tensions still simmer over trade, territory, and sovereignty. And within those embers, old disputes and rivalries may yet resurface. And with that, we've reached the end of the American Revolutionary War series. Whether you've been here from the very first episode, or you've joined somewhere along the way, your support, comments, and engagement have been hugely appreciated. Thank you. If you'd like to support my work further, please do consider subscribing and join the conversation in deciding what topic is covered next on the channel. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next chapter.